The candle flame shook as the door burst open, and Edmund Hartley, Duke of Ashford, stood in the frame, with a look that made every servant in the hallway freeze where they stood. Inside the birthing chamber, Eleanor Whitmore lay pale and trembling, her third daughter wrapped in white cloth against her chest. She had waited for this moment, with hope pressed so tightly in her heart that she had almost convinced herself this time would be different. It was not. The midwife had barely announced the child was healthy, before Edmund's face changed from anxious anticipation to cold, unreadable stone. He did not step closer to the bed. He did not ask to hold his newborn daughter. He simply stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the small bundle as if it had personally wronged him. Eleanor searched his face for even a flicker of warmth, the way she had after the births of her first two daughters, Alice and Beatrice. There had been disappointment then too, but never this. Never a silence so heavy it seemed to press the air out of the room. "Another girl," he said at last, his voice flat, almost bored, as though reading a line from someone else's script. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. What could she say? She had not chosen the child's sex. No mother could. Yet in this house, in this family that had ruled Ashford for 6 generations, a woman's worth was measured by the son she failed to produce. Edmund turned on his heel and walked out without another word, his boots echoing down the corridor, long after he had gone. The midwife exchanged a glance with the nurse standing near the window, and neither of them said anything, though both understood exactly what that silence meant. Word had already spread through the servants' quarters days earlier, whispered between polishing silver and folding linens. The Duke's mistress, a woman named Vivian Marsh, was carrying his child. And everyone in the house, from the stable boy to the head housekeeper, understood that Edmund was praying, with an intensity bordering on obsession, that Vivian's child would be the son Eleanor could not give him. Eleanor lay in bed that night with her newborn daughter asleep beside her, listening to the house breathe around her the way old houses do, creaking and settling, holding its secrets in every wall. She thought of her wedding day, 6 years earlier, when Edmund had looked at her with something that resembled affection, even if it had never quite been love. She thought of the early years, when his ambition and her patience had seemed like a fair trade for a peaceful life. She thought of how quickly that peace had crumbled the moment their first child had been a girl. Alice was 5 now, a curious child with her mother's soft brown eyes, and an unshakable habit of asking questions no one wanted to answer. Beatrice was 3, quieter, more watchful, the kind of child who noticed everything and said little. And now there was a third, still unnamed, still small enough to fit entirely within the crook of Eleanor's arm. She looked down at her sleeping daughter and made a silent promise that no matter what happened in this house, no matter how her husband treated them, these 3 girls would grow up knowing they were wanted. The following morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of hurried footsteps outside her door. She sat up carefully, her body still weak, and called for the maid, a young woman named Clara who had served in the household for 2 years and had grown fond of the Duchess in a way that went beyond simple duty. Clara entered with red eyes and a face that suggested she had been crying, or trying very hard not to. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Clara hesitated, twisting the corner of her apron between her fingers. "The Duke has called for a meeting in the main hall, Your Grace. He has invited guests, lords and ladies from the neighboring estates. He says he has an announcement to make." Clara's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach, the kind of dread that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation of a fear already carried too long. "Today?" Eleanor asked. "The day after I have given birth?" Clara nodded, unable to meet her mistress's eyes. "He says it cannot wait, Your Grace. There is more, if you wish to hear it." Eleanor pressed her lips together and nodded once, steeling herself. "Tell me." "His cousin has arrived," Clara said quietly. "Mr. Percival Hartley. He came in on the early coach from the south, though no one sent for him that I know of. He has been asking the housekeeper a great many questions about the succession papers kept in the estate office." Eleanor frowned at this, the name settling uneasily in her memory. Percival Hartley was a distant cousin of Edmund's, a man in his 40s, who stood to inherit Ashford's title and lands, should Edmund die without a son to carry the name forward. Eleanor had met him only twice before, both times at large family gatherings, where he had said little and watched everything. his pale eyes tracking the movements of the household with the quiet patience of a man, counting years rather than days. "Does the Duke know he is here?" Eleanor asked. "I believe so, Your Grace. They took breakfast together this morning, in the small study." Eleanor considered this new information carefully, understanding immediately that Percival's timely arrival, so soon after the birth of a third daughter, was unlikely to be a coincidence. Men like Percival did not travel across the country on a whim. They came when opportunity presented itself, and the birth of another daughter, another failure to produce an heir, represented exactly the sort of opportunity a patient, calculating cousin might have been waiting years to see unfold. Eleanor rose from the bed, despite the ache in her body, despite the midwife's insistence the night before that she rest for at least a week. She would not give Edmund the satisfaction of announcing whatever he intended to announce while she remained hidden away, weak and voiceless, in this room. Whatever storm was coming, and whatever role this newly arrived cousin intended to play within it, she would face it standing, not lying down. Clara helped her dress, choosing a deep blue gown that Eleanor had always favored, the one that made her look every bit the Duchess she had earned the right to be called, regardless of what happened in that hall tonight. As Clara fastened the final buttons, she glanced at Eleanor's reflection in the mirror and said quietly, "Whatever he says, Your Grace, the staff below stairs, we know the truth. We see what kind of woman you are. That will never change, no matter what he does, and no matter what that cousin of his hopes to gain from it." Eleanor's throat tightened at the unexpected kindness, and she reached out to squeeze Clara's hand before straightening her shoulders and walking toward the door. Her daughters were waiting outside, Alice holding Beatrice's small hand, both of them dressed in matching cream-colored frocks by the nursery maid, sensing without being told that something important, something frightening, was about to happen. "Where is Father going?" Alice asked, looking up at her mother with the directness only a 5-year-old could manage. "He is going to speak with his guests," Eleanor said carefully, crouching down despite the discomfort it caused her. "And we are going to listen, and we are going to be brave, whatever we hear. Can you do that for me?" Alice nodded solemnly, though her eyes were wide with uncertainty. Beatrice said nothing, but she gripped her sister's hand a little tighter. The main hall of Ashford Manor had been built to impress, with towering ceilings and long windows that let in streams of afternoon light, illuminating the polished marble floor and the rows of ancestral portraits that lined the walls. Tonight, that same hall was filled with the low murmur of gathered lords and ladies, all of them dressed in their finest, all of them curious about the sudden summons that had pulled them from their own estates on such short notice. Edmund stood at the head of the room, near the great fireplace, a glass of wine in his hand, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from believing yourself entirely justified in whatever you were about to do. Beside him, though slightly apart, as though even now she understood the impropriety of standing too close, was Vivian Marsh. She wore a gown the color of deep wine, cut in a style that made no attempt to hide the small but unmistakable curve of her belly. A few of the gathered guests exchanged startled glances, whispering behind gloved hands. Not far from Edmund, near a tall window overlooking the eastern gardens, stood Percival Hartley, his hands folded neatly behind his back, his expression carefully neutral in the manner of a man who had trained himself for years never to reveal what he truly felt. He caught Eleanor's eye briefly as she entered the hall and inclined his head toward her with a small, formal bow that carried no warmth whatsoever, only the cold courtesy of distant family obligation. When Eleanor entered with her daughters, the room fell into an uneasy hush. She walked forward with her chin held high, though every eye in the room seemed to weigh on her like stones. She took her place near the front, close enough to hear clearly, far enough that she would not have to stand beside the husband who had not spoken a single word to her since walking away from her bedside the night before. Edmund cleared his throat, and the room fell completely silent. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying easily across the marble hall, "I have called you here tonight because the future of Ashford must be secured, and I believe in being direct, rather than allowing rumors to spread unchecked." He paused, glancing briefly toward Eleanor, and for one fleeting second, she thought she saw something like guilt cross his features. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "As many of you may already suspect, my wife has given birth to our third daughter." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone near the back offered a soft, awkward congratulation, though it died quickly in the tense atmosphere of the room. "I have decided," Edmund continued, "that for the sake of the Ashford line, For the sake of an heir who can carry this family's name and legacy forward, I will be setting aside my current arrangement." He said it so plainly, so casually, as though discussing the reorganization of his stables rather than the dissolution of his marriage. "Miss Vivian Marsh is expecting my child, and I have every reason to believe it will be the son this family has waited generations to see." The room erupted into hushed but unmistakable shock. Eleanor felt Alice's small hand slip into hers, gripping tightly, though the child could not possibly understand the full weight of what had just been said. Beatrice pressed herself against her mother's skirts, sensing the tension without needing the words explained. An older lord near the front, a longtime friend of Edmund's late father, rose slightly from his seat. "Edmund," he said carefully, "surely you do not mean to publicly humiliate your wife in this manner. There are ways to handle family matters privately." Edmund's expression hardened. "I mean to be honest, Lord Aldridge. I see no virtue in hiding truth behind closed doors when the future of this estate is at stake." He turned his gaze toward Eleanor for the first time since she had entered the room, and his eyes held nothing she recognized from the man she had married. "Eleanor has given me daughters, 3 lovely daughters, whom I do not doubt she loves dearly. But daughters cannot inherit Ashford under the terms of my father's will. I need a son, and I intend to have one." Eleanor stood very still, feeling the eyes of the entire room upon her, feeling the particular cruelty of being discussed, as though she were not standing directly in front of the man discussing her. She thought of 100 things she might say, accusations, pleas, arguments about fairness and decency. But looking at her daughter's frightened faces, she understood that nothing she said in this room, in front of these people, would change what Edmund had already decided long before tonight. She noticed, too, the way Percival watched this entire exchange with careful, patient attention, saying nothing, offering no argument in her defense, but also none of the eager anticipation she might have expected from a man hoping to inherit an estate that would otherwise pass to a legitimate son. His stillness troubled her more than open hostility might have. It suggested a man content to let events unfold exactly as they wished to unfold, confident that whatever happened, some opportunity would eventually present itself to his advantage. "I understand," she said instead, her voice steady in a way that surprised even herself. "You have made your position quite clear, Edmund." The use of his given name, rather than his title, seemed to catch him off guard, a small crack in his carefully constructed composure. Vivian, standing slightly behind him, allowed the faintest smile to touch her lips, quickly hidden behind a raised hand, as though covering a polite cough. Eleanor caught the gesture, and understood immediately that this was no simple matter of a man's wandering affections. Vivian wanted this, had perhaps orchestrated more of this than anyone in the room realized. The Dowager Duchess, Edmund's grandmother, a formidable woman named Agnes, who had ruled Ashford's household with an iron will for decades, before passing the reins to her son and then her grandson, sat near the fireplace, with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face betrayed nothing, but her eyes, sharp and knowing, moved between Edmund, Vivian, Percival, and Eleanor, with an intensity that suggested she understood far more about this situation than she was letting on. "This meeting is finished," Edmund announced, setting down his wineglass with a decisive clink against the mantel. "I trust you will all extend the same courtesy and discretion to this family that you always have." The guests began filing out in uncomfortable silence, murmuring among themselves the moment they believed themselves out of earshot. Percival lingered near the window a moment longer than the others, watching Eleanor gather her daughters with an expression that, for just an instant, seemed almost sympathetic, before hardening back into its usual careful neutrality. Eleanor gathered her daughters close and turned to leave as well, refusing to give Edmund the satisfaction of watching her break down in front of him. "Eleanor," Edmund called after her, and she paused, though she did not turn to face him. "I will ensure you and the girls are provided for. This need not be ugly." She turned then, slowly, and looked at him with an expression that held more pity than anger. "You stood in front of our friends and neighbors and told them our daughters do not matter to the future of this family. You cannot undo that with promises of provisions, Edmund. Some things, once said, cannot be taken back." She walked away before he could respond, her daughters close beside her, and behind her she heard Vivian's voice, low and satisfied, murmuring something to Edmund that she could not quite make out. It did not matter. She had heard enough tonight to understand exactly where she stood, and exactly what she would need to do next. As Eleanor climbed the staircase toward the nursery, carrying Beatrice, who had grown tired and quiet, while Alice trailed behind, clutching the hem of her mother's gown, she caught sight of Agnes standing at the top of the stairs, waiting for her with an expression Eleanor could not immediately read. "A word, my dear," Agnes said quietly. "Before you retire for the evening, I believe there are things you should know, things about this family that my grandson has conveniently chosen to forget, and things about the cousin who arrived so conveniently this very morning that trouble me a great deal more than I wish to admit." Eleanor paused, exhaustion pulling at every part of her body, curiosity and dread mixing uneasily in her chest. Whatever Agnes wished to tell her, she sensed it would change everything she thought she understood about the night that had just unfolded, and about the nights still to come. She nodded, and followed the old woman down the corridor, her daughter's small hands still held tightly in her own, carrying with her the quiet certainty that the story of this family was far from finished, no matter how confidently Edmund believed he had already written its ending, and no matter how patiently his distant cousin seemed willing to wait for his own chance to reshape that ending entirely. Agnes led her into a private sitting room at the end of the east corridor, a room Eleanor had rarely entered in her 6 years at Ashford, filled with old portraits and a fireplace that crackled softly against the evening chill. She gestured for Eleanor to sit, and once the maid had settled the sleepy Beatrice and curious Alice into a nearby chair with a plate of biscuits to occupy them, Agnes began to speak in a low, measured voice that carried the weight of long-buried history. "My son, Edmund's father, tried something very similar to this, many years ago," Agnes said, her eyes fixed on the fire rather than on Eleanor. "He believed a son was owed to him by fate itself, and when his first wife gave him only daughters, he sought comfort elsewhere, just as Edmund has done. He was certain, absolutely certain, that setting her aside would solve everything."
"What happened?"
Eleanor asked quietly, though something in her chest already sensed that the answer would not be a happy one.
"He lost everything that mattered,"
Agnes said simply. "Not immediately. It took years. But the woman he cast aside built a life far greater than the one he offered her, and the woman he chose instead brought him nothing but ruin and regret. Edmund does not remember these details, because he was too young, and because I have never spoken of them in his presence. But I will not watch him repeat his father's mistakes without at least offering you the truth of what came before." Eleanor absorbed this in silence, watching her daughters across the room, Alice quietly explaining something to Beatrice, with the serious authority only an older sibling could manage. "And Percival?" Eleanor asked after a moment. "What is his part in all of this? He arrived very early this morning, before anyone could have sent word of what Edmund intended to announce tonight." Agnes's expression tightened, a flicker of genuine concern crossing her otherwise composed features. "Percival has always been patient, my dear. More patient than any man his age has a right to be. He has waited nearly 15 years for the chance that Edmund might fail to produce a legitimate son. I do not believe he sent word ahead of himself because he did not need to. He has kept a man in Ashford's own village for years. Someone paid quietly to send word the moment anything of significance occurred within this household. I have suspected it for some time, though I have never been able to prove it outright. Then he already knew the child was a daughter before Edmund even made his announcement," Eleanor said slowly, understanding dawning with unpleasant clarity. "Almost certainly," Agnes replied, "and I suspect he has come now not merely to observe, but to encourage Edmund toward exactly the sort of reckless decision he made tonight. A public scandal, a set-aside wife, an unproven mistress carrying an unconfirmed child, all of this creates exactly the kind of instability that benefits a man waiting patiently in the wings for the entire arrangement to collapse under its own weight." Eleanor felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the evening's temperature. "You believe Percival wants Edmund to fail. I believe," Agnes said carefully, "that Percival cares nothing for whether Edmund succeeds or fails, only for whether the outcome ultimately benefits himself. If Vivian's child proves to be a son, Percival loses his claim entirely, and I imagine he understands this risk well enough. But if something should go wrong, if this entire arrangement should collapse in scandal or disgrace, he stands ready to argue that Edmund has proven himself unfit to manage the family's affairs, and that the title should pass to a more stable branch of the family, sooner rather than later. Eleanor considered this new information carefully, understanding immediately that whatever difficulties lay ahead for herself and her daughters, the situation at Ashford was considerably more complicated than a simple matter of a husband's cruelty and a mistress's ambition. There were other forces at work here, patient and calculating, watching from the shadows for their own opportunity to benefit from whatever chaos Edmund's choices might eventually produce. "What would you have me do?" Eleanor asked. Agnes considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I would have you protect yourself and your daughters first, above all other considerations. Whatever happens between Edmund, Vivian, and Percival in the months ahead, none of it should be allowed to touch the three of you any further than it already has. I intend to help you build a life away from this house, a life that owes nothing to Ashford's title or its complicated politics of inheritance." Eleanor felt something shift within her chest at these words, a quiet resolve beginning to take shape where only fear and uncertainty had existed moments before. "You would help me leave?" "I would insist upon it," Agnes said firmly. "This house has never been kind to the women who married into it, and I will not watch it consume you and your daughters, the way it very nearly consumed me, decades ago, before I learned to protect myself within its walls, rather than simply enduring whatever cruelty passed for tradition here." They spoke for a while longer, Agnes sharing careful details about the practical steps Eleanor might take, the funds that could be quietly arranged, the property near the coast that had belonged to Eleanor's own mother, and remained entirely outside any claim Edmund or his family might attempt to make upon it. By the time Eleanor finally rose to return to her chambers, carrying a sleeping Beatrice, while Alice trailed drowsily behind her, she carried with her not only exhaustion, but a genuine sense of purpose that had been entirely absent just hours earlier. Morning came gray and quiet over Ashford, the kind of light that made the manor look older than it was, as though the stones themselves were tired of holding so many secrets. Eleanor had not slept. She had spent most of the night sitting by the window in her room, watching the gardens below, turning over every word Agnes had shared with her, weighing what it meant for her own future, and for the futures of her three daughters, sleeping soundly in the next room. By the time Clara arrived with breakfast, Eleanor had already made several decisions, though she kept them close, unwilling to share them, even with someone as trustworthy as her maid. She ate little, her mind occupied with practical matters that had nothing to do with hunger. She needed money that was truly her own, not tied to Edmund's approval. She needed a place to go that would not immediately be discovered, and she needed time, precious time, before Edmund, or Percival, could act on whatever plans either of them had already set in motion. She found that time sooner than expected, because Edmund himself seemed eager to avoid her presence entirely. For 3 days following the announcement in the Great Hall, he did not seek her out, did not ask after the health of his newborn daughter, and spent most of his hours locked away in his study with Percival, or riding out to visit the estate where Vivian now resided, having been moved there under the pretense of a family friend requiring companionship, a thin excuse that fooled absolutely no one among the household staff. Eleanor used this silence to her advantage. She began, quietly and carefully, going through the small collection of jewelry and personal items that had belonged to her own mother, pieces that had come to Eleanor upon her marriage, and that legally belonged to her alone, separate from anything tied to the Ashford estate. She wrote letters, careful and deliberate, to a solicitor in the nearby town of Millbrook, a man named Arthur Pembroke, who had once handled matters for her late father and who she trusted to keep her confidence. She also wrote 3 letters that she folded and sealed with wax, each one addressed simply to Alice, Beatrice, and the newborn daughter she had finally named Charlotte, after her own mother. These letters she did not intend to deliver now. They were meant for later, for a day when her daughters were old enough to understand the choices their mother had made, and why she had made them not out of weakness or shame, but out of a fierce, unshakable love that refused to bend to a man's cruelty, or to the quiet scheming of a cousin who cared nothing for any of them, beyond what their misfortune might grant him. On the 4th day, Agnes summoned Eleanor once more to the private sitting room, and this time she did not waste time with pleasantries. "You are planning something," the old woman said, studying Eleanor's face with the same sharp attention she seemed to bring to everything. "I can see it in the way you carry yourself now. Tell me what you intend to do." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before deciding that honesty, at least with this woman who had already shown her unexpected kindness, was the wiser path. I intend to leave, your grace. Not in anger, and not in shame, but because I will not stay in a house where my daughters are treated as failures, for the simple fact of being born girls, and where a cousin's patient ambition threatens to make everything worse before it ever gets better. I have a small property that came to me through my mother, a cottage near the coast, in a village called Hartwell. It is modest, but it is mine, free of any claim Edmund or Percival might make upon it. Agnes was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the armrest beneath her hands. You understand that leaving will not be simple. Edmund may allow it easily enough, given his current preoccupations, but there will be talk, cruel talk, and your daughters will bear some of that weight as they grow, whether it is fair or not. And Percival will certainly take notice. A departed wife and 3 absent daughters make his eventual argument for Edmund's instability all the easier to construct. I understand, Eleanor said, but I would rather they grow up hearing cruel talk about a mother who left with her dignity intact, than grow up watching that same mother beg a man for scraps of affection he has already decided not to give. All while a cousin circles the entire family, like a patient bird of prey, waiting for the moment to strike. Something in Agnes's expression softened, an emotion Eleanor had not expected to see on the old woman's typically composed face. Your mother would be proud of you, Agnes said quietly. I did not know her well, but I remember her as a woman of considerable strength. It seems that strength did not skip a generation. Eleanor felt unexpected tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let emotion overtake the careful composure she had worked so hard to maintain. Will you help me? She asked, the question feeling strange on her lips, since she had never imagined needing to ask this particular woman for anything. Agnes nodded slowly. I will provide you with a carriage and a driver I trust completely, a man named Nathaniel, who has served this family for 30 years, and whose loyalty to me exceeds any loyalty he might feel toward my grandson. I will also ensure that certain funds that are technically mine to distribute as I see fit under the terms of my late husband's will, find their way into your possession before you go. Consider it not charity, but justice, long overdue. Eleanor did not know how to properly express her gratitude, so she simply reached out and took the old woman's hands in her own, holding them for a long moment in silent thanks. Whatever coldness existed elsewhere in this family, whatever cruelty Edmund had shown, and whatever quiet danger Percival represented, this small act of solidarity between 2 women who understood exactly what it meant to be undervalued, in a house built on the assumption that only sons mattered, meant more than words could easily capture. That afternoon, word reached the manor that Vivian had requested an audience with the household staff, an unusual demand for a woman whose position remained, at least officially, unofficial. She arrived in the main hall dressed in fine silks, her belly now more visibly rounded beneath the fabric, and addressed the assembled servants with the confidence of someone who already considered herself mistress of the house. I understand there may be some confusion about how things will proceed in the coming months, Vivian began, her voice carrying a practiced sweetness that did not quite mask the steel beneath it. I want to assure you all that once my child is born, and once appropriate arrangements have been finalized, I intend to run this household with the same care and attention that any of you would expect from a proper duchess. The servants exchanged uneasy glances, none of them quite willing to meet Vivian's eyes directly, though a few, particularly the younger maids who had grown attached to Eleanor over the years, could not fully hide their discomfort at the presumption in Vivian's tone. Percival, who had positioned himself near the back of the hall to observe this address, watched with the same careful neutrality he brought to everything, offering no support and no objection, simply gathering information he might one day find useful. Where is the current duchess? One of the older footmen asked, his voice carefully neutral. Shouldn't matters of the household still fall under her direction, until such time as things are formally settled? Vivian's expression flickered, just briefly, with irritation, before smoothing back into practiced pleasantness. The Duke has made his intentions quite clear. I would advise everyone to consider where their loyalties will be most beneficially placed in the coming months. The threat, thinly veiled as friendly advice, was not lost on anyone in the room. Clara, standing near the back of the gathered staff, felt a surge of anger she had to work hard to suppress. She had served Eleanor faithfully for 2 years and had come to genuinely respect her mistress, not merely out of duty, but out of real admiration for the quiet strength Eleanor carried through every humiliation Edmund had subjected her to. She said nothing in the moment, understanding the danger of open defiance, but she resolved silently to do everything within her power to assist Eleanor in whatever plans she might be forming. That evening, as the household settled into its usual quiet routines, Clara found a moment alone with Eleanor in the nursery, where Charlotte slept peacefully in her cradle, while Alice and Beatrice played quietly with a set of wooden blocks nearby. "Your Grace," Clara said softly, glancing toward the door to ensure they were not overheard. "Whatever you decide to do, however you decide to proceed, I want you to know I am prepared to help in any way I can. I have grown fond of this family, and I do not believe this house deserves to lose you and the young ladies." Eleanor looked at the young maid with genuine warmth, grateful beyond words for the loyalty she had not expected to find in a house that had shown her so little kindness from its master. "Thank you, Clara. I may indeed need your help, sooner than you realize." Over the following week, preparations moved forward with careful discretion. Nathaniel, the trusted driver Agnes had spoken of, began quietly arranging the logistics of a journey to Hartwell, ensuring the route would avoid the main roads where Edmund's associates, or Percival's paid informants, might recognize the Ashford carriage. Arthur Pembroke, the solicitor in Millbrook, confirmed through careful correspondence that Eleanor's inherited cottage remained in good condition and legally unencumbered by any claim from her marriage, a detail he verified twice over, given the delicacy of the situation, and his awareness, gleaned from Eleanor's careful letters, that more than one interested party might wish to complicate her departure. Percival, meanwhile, had settled into Ashford with an ease that suggested he intended to remain far longer than the brief visit he had originally implied. He spent his mornings reviewing old estate ledgers with the steward, his afternoons riding the boundaries of the property with a surveyor's careful attention, and his evenings dining with Edmund, offering quiet, seemingly reasonable counsel that Eleanor suspected served his own interests far more than her husband's. "You should consider formalizing matters regarding the girls sooner rather than later," she overheard Percival say one evening, his voice carrying faintly through the study door as she passed in the corridor above, carrying Charlotte toward the nursery. A clean, documented separation of their claims from any future son would protect the estate from complications down the road, whatever shape those complications might eventually take. Edmund's reply was too quiet for Eleanor to make out clearly, but she did not need to hear his exact words to understand the direction of the conversation. Percival was not merely observing from a distance. He was actively shaping Edmund's decisions, nudging him toward choices that would create precisely the kind of instability and legal complexity that might, eventually, work to Percival's own advantage should anything go wrong with Vivian's pregnancy or Edmund's plans more broadly. She mentioned this to Agnes the following morning, finding the old woman in her private sitting room, reviewing correspondence with the same careful attention she brought to all matters concerning the family's welfare. "He grows bolder each day," Agnes said grimly, upon hearing Eleanor's account. "I had hoped he might simply observe from the shadows, as he has done for years. But it seems the birth of your third daughter has convinced him. The moment has finally arrived to press his advantage more directly. Should we be concerned he might act against the girls somehow?" Eleanor asked, a new anxiety creeping into her voice that had not been present before. Agnes considered this carefully. "I do not believe Percival would act with any direct malice toward your daughters. His ambitions run toward the title and the estate itself, not toward causing harm to children who, in his calculations, already possess no legitimate claim to what he seeks. But I would not put it past him to encourage Edmund toward decisions that ultimately harm all of you, simply because such decisions serve his own patient strategy. The sooner you and the girls are safely away from Ashford, away from his observation and his influence over Edmund, the better I shall sleep at night." This conversation only strengthened Eleanor's resolve, and she quickened her preparations accordingly, working with Clara late into several evenings to sort through which belongings truly mattered and which could be left behind without regret. She wrote a final letter to Arthur Pembroke, confirming the exact date of her planned departure, careful to route the correspondence through a trusted village messenger rather than the estate's usual channels, mindful now of Agnes's suggestion that Percival had long kept eyes and ears within Ashford's own village. The carriage wheels ground softly against the gravel drive at 4 a.m, long before the household staff would rise for their usual duties, long before Edmund, wherever he had spent the night, or Percival, whose window Eleanor had noted remained dark as they passed beneath it, would think to check whether his wife remained within the walls of Ashford Manor. Nathaniel had positioned the carriage near the side entrance, away from the main gates where a passing rider might notice unusual activity, and Clara stood waiting with a single small trunk containing Eleanor's most essential belongings, having volunteered without hesitation to accompany her former mistress into whatever uncertain future awaited them. Eleanor carried Charlotte wrapped snugly against the early morning chill, while Alice walked beside her, clutching a small wooden doll that had belonged to her grandmother, and Beatrice rode in Clara's arms, still half asleep and unaware of the significance of this particular morning. None of them spoke as they crossed the courtyard, the only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the distant call of an owl settling into its nest for the day. As Nathaniel helped Eleanor into the carriage, she paused for a moment and looked back at the manor house, its gray stone walls catching the first faint hints of dawn light along the eastern horizon. 6 years of her life had unfolded within those walls, years of hope and disappointment, of small joys found in her daughter's laughter, and larger sorrows found in her husband's growing coldness. And, in these final weeks, the quiet unease of a cousin's patient scheming, layered atop everything else. She felt no regret in leaving, only a quiet acknowledgement that this chapter of her life had reached its natural conclusion, whether she had chosen its ending or not. Agnes appeared briefly at an upstairs window, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light, and Eleanor lifted her hand in a small gesture of farewell before climbing fully into the carriage. Nathaniel closed the door softly behind her, climbed into his seat, and with a gentle click of his tongue, urged the horses forward, carrying the small family away from Ashford and toward whatever awaited them along the winding coastal roads leading to Hartwell. The journey took the better part of 2 days, and proved considerably more eventful than Eleanor had anticipated. On the first afternoon, as the carriage navigated a narrow stretch of road cutting through dense woodland, one of the rear wheels struck a deep rut hidden beneath fallen leaves, cracking the wooden rim with a sound loud enough to startle the horses and bring the entire carriage lurching to an uneven halt. Nathaniel climbed down immediately to inspect the damage, his weathered face creasing with concern as he examined the splintered wood. "It will need proper repair before we can continue safely, Your Grace," he said, straightening up and glancing at the darkening sky above the tree line. "There is a village not far from here, perhaps 2 miles further along this road. I recall a wheelwright there from my younger days, if his shop still stands." They proceeded slowly, the carriage groaning with each turn of the damaged wheel, until they reached the small village Nathaniel had described, where a kindly wheelwright named Walter Finch agreed to repair the damage that same evening, refusing any payment beyond what Nathaniel insisted upon pressing into his hands. His wife, a warm, round-faced woman who introduced herself simply as Mrs. Finch, took one look at the exhausted children and insisted the family rest in her own kitchen while the repairs proceeded, feeding them a simple but generous meal of bread, cheese, and warm broth that Alice later declared to be the finest food she had ever tasted, a declaration that made Eleanor laugh for the first time in what felt like many long weeks. "Where are you bound, if you don't mind my asking?" Mrs. Finch inquired as she settled Charlotte against her shoulder, rocking the infant gently while Eleanor ate. "Hartwell," Eleanor replied, "a village along the coast. My mother's family came from there." "A fine place, from what I have heard," Mrs. Finch said warmly. "Good sea air, and good people, though I have never traveled that far myself. You will find good fortune there, I should think, whatever brings you on this journey." Eleanor found herself grateful for the simple kindness of strangers who asked no further questions, who offered warmth and comfort without requiring explanation or justification for a duchess traveling with 3 young children and a single maid, far from any grand carriage procession one might expect to accompany a woman of her former station. It struck her, sitting in that modest kitchen with its low ceiling and the smell of fresh bread lingering in the air, that this small village held more genuine kindness than she had experienced during many months at Ashford, surrounded by wealth and titles that had ultimately meant nothing when it came to genuine human decency. They resumed their journey the following morning, the repaired wheel holding steady beneath them, as Nathaniel guided the horses along roads that grew increasingly unfamiliar to Eleanor. winding closer to the coast with each passing mile. Alice, despite the strangeness of the situation, found the remainder of the journey exciting rather than frightening. Pressing her face against the carriage window to watch the countryside roll past, asking Nathaniel a steady stream of questions about the horses, the villages they passed, and whether the sea, when they finally reached it, would truly be as vast as her mother had described. Beatrice remained quieter throughout the journey, watching everything with the same careful attention she brought to all things, occasionally reaching out to hold her mother's hand without explanation, as though seeking reassurance that whatever was happening, whatever had changed so suddenly in their lives, would ultimately be all right. Eleanor squeezed her daughter's small hand each time, offering silent comfort that she hoped conveyed more confidence than she genuinely felt. Clara proved an invaluable companion throughout the journey, keeping Charlotte comfortable and fed, entertaining Alice with quiet songs when her questions finally exhausted themselves, and providing Eleanor with moments of much-needed rest as the strain of the past week finally began to catch up with her. By the time the carriage crested the final hill overlooking Hartwell on the second afternoon, all four of them were exhausted, but the sight that greeted them stirred something in Eleanor that felt remarkably close to genuine excitement. The village of Hartwell spread out below them, in a gentle curve along the coastline, small cottages with thatched roofs scattered among green fields that sloped down toward cliffs overlooking a wide expanse of blue-gray sea. Fishing boats bobbed gently in the small harbor, and smoke curled up from chimneys throughout the village, suggesting a community both modest and comfortably self-sufficient. Eleanor's mother had grown up in this village before marrying and moving inland, and though Eleanor herself had visited only a handful of times as a child, something about the sight of it now felt unmistakably like coming home. Her mother's cottage sat at the edge of the village, slightly removed from the cluster of homes nearer the harbor, surrounded by a small but well-tended garden that had clearly been maintained by a caretaker in her mother's absence over the years. Nathaniel brought the carriage to a stop before the small wooden gate, and Eleanor stepped down onto solid ground for the first time in 2 days, breathing in air that smelled of salt and earth, and something she could only describe as freedom. The cottage itself was modest by the standards Eleanor had grown accustomed to at Ashford, with only 4 rooms and a small loft space above, but it was solid and dry, with a well-built hearth and windows that let in generous amounts of afternoon light. As Clara began unpacking their few belongings and settling Charlotte into a makeshift cradle, fashioned from a drawer lined with soft blankets, Eleanor walked through each room slowly, running her hands along the simple wooden furniture, feeling something she had not expected to feel so strongly, a sense of ownership, of belonging, entirely separate from any title or position a husband had granted her. That first evening, as the sun set over the sea and cast long orange light across the cottage's small garden, Eleanor sat outside with Alice and Beatrice, while Clara prepared a simple meal from provisions Nathaniel had procured in the village earlier that afternoon. Alice asked, as she often did, when they would return to Ashford, and Eleanor considered her answer carefully before responding. "We will not be returning to Ashford, my darling," she said gently. "This is our home now. It may be smaller than what you are used to, but I promise you, it will be filled with more love and more happiness than that house ever offered us."
Alice considered this with the serious concentration she brought to most matters, then nodded slowly. "Will Father visit us here?"
Eleanor hesitated, unwilling to promise something she could not guarantee, but equally unwilling to speak ill of the girl's father, in a way that might color their understanding of him before they were old enough to form their own judgments. "I do not know, Alice, but wherever he is, and whatever he chooses to do, you and your sisters will always have me, and I will never leave you. Not for any reason." Beatrice, who had been quiet throughout most of the conversation, finally spoke up in her soft, thoughtful voice.
"I like it here better already, Mama. It smells like the sea, and there are no cold rooms like at home."
Eleanor laughed softly, pulling her middle daughter into a gentle embrace, grateful for the simple honesty of a child's perspective, uncomplicated by the layers of expectation and disappointment that had governed so much of adult life at Ashford, and untouched, for now, by the patient scheming of a cousin who would soon discover that his careful plans had been built upon a foundation far less stable than he had assumed. Back at Ashford, the household had woken that morning to discover the Duchess and her daughters missing, along with Clara and Nathaniel, though it took the better part of the day for anyone to work up the courage to inform Edmund of this development. When he finally learned of it, Having returned late in the afternoon from another visit to Vivian's estate, his reaction was not what the assembled staff had expected. Rather than fury, Edmund appeared almost relieved, as though Eleanor's departure had solved a complication he had not fully known how to address himself. He asked only whether she had taken anything belonging to the estate, and upon learning that she had taken nothing but her own personal belongings and the small allowance Agnes had quietly arranged, he seemed satisfied enough to let the matter rest without further investigation. Percival, however, received the news with considerably more interest. He found Edmund in the study that evening, staring into the fire with an expression of distracted relief, and settled into the chair across from him with the unhurried patience of a man who had learned long ago that rushing a conversation rarely produced the results he desired. "This changes things rather significantly, does it not?" Percival said carefully, watching his cousin's face for any reaction. "A wife who has abandoned the household, taking your 3 daughters with her. Some might consider that grounds for questioning the stability of your household arrangements more broadly." Edmund looked up sharply, some of his earlier relief giving way to wariness. "Eleanor has left of her own accord, Percival. I have no intention of pursuing her or the girls, if that is what you are suggesting. This arrangement suits everyone involved, far better than the alternative." "Of course," Percival said smoothly, raising his hands in a gesture of gentle concession. "I only mean to observe that such developments, however convenient they might seem in the moment, tend to attract attention from those who concern themselves with the proper management of family estates. Should questions ever arise about your judgment in these matters, it would be helpful to have clear documentation showing that you acted reasonably throughout, rather than allowing circumstances to simply unfold without proper oversight." Edmund studied his cousin for a long moment, some instinct stirring within him that he could not quite name, a vague unease at the careful way Percival phrased his observations, always suggesting concern for Edmund's well-being, while somehow always steering the conversation toward documentation, oversight, and the kind of formal arrangements that would serve Percival's own interests should anything go wrong in the months ahead. But his mind remained too consumed with anticipation of Vivian's child, too eager to believe that his current path led toward the son he so desperately wanted, to examine his cousin's motivations with the scrutiny they perhaps deserved. "I appreciate your concern, Percival," Edmund said finally, "but I believe I am managing my affairs adequately. Once Vivian's child arrives, and assuming he proves to be the son we both expect, these questions of documentation and oversight will resolve themselves quite naturally." "Of course," Percival repeated, rising from his chair with the same unhurried grace that characterized all his movements. "I only wish to be helpful, cousin. Family, after all, ought to support one another through difficult transitions such as this." Agnes, watching this dynamic unfold over the following weeks with growing concern, found herself increasingly convinced that Percival intended to position himself as an indispensable advisor to Edmund, gradually accumulating knowledge and influence that he might later leverage should circumstances turn against her grandson. She began, quietly and without drawing attention to her efforts, keeping her own careful records of Percival's activities and statements, understanding that documentation might eventually prove useful in countering whatever narrative he attempted to construct. In Hartwell, meanwhile, life began taking shape with a speed and stability that surprised even Eleanor. Word spread quickly through the small village that the daughter of a woman fondly remembered by many of the older residents had returned to claim her mother's cottage, and within days, neighbors began arriving with small gifts of food, offers of assistance, and the kind of warm, uncomplicated welcome that Eleanor had rarely experienced during her years at Ashford. A woman named Margaret Fairweather, who ran the village's small general store and had known Eleanor's mother well during their youth, took a particular interest in helping Eleanor establish herself, offering practical advice about managing a household on a modest budget and introducing her to other women in the village who might become valuable friends and allies in the months ahead. Eleanor found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, surrounded by a community that valued her not for her title or her ability to produce an heir, but simply for who she was as a person and a mother. As the first weeks in Hartwell settled into a comfortable rhythm, Eleanor began considering more carefully what her future, and the futures of her 3 daughters, might actually look like. She had brought with her a modest sum of money, enough to sustain the household for perhaps a year if managed carefully. but she understood clearly that she would need to find some way to generate income of her own if she hoped to build a lasting, independent life, free from any dependence on Edmund's goodwill, which she had already learned could not be relied upon under any circumstances, and doubly free from any entanglement in whatever quiet contest was unfolding between Edmund and his patient cousin back at Ashford. It was Margaret who first suggested a possibility that Eleanor had not previously considered. "Your mother was known throughout this village for her skill with herbs and remedies," Margaret said one afternoon as they sat together in the small garden behind Eleanor's cottage, watching Alice and Beatrice chase each other through the rows of flowering plants. "She helped deliver half the babies born in Hartwell over 20 years, and her remedies for fever and cough were sought after even by families in the neighboring villages. Did she never teach you any of what she knew?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, memories stirring of childhood visits to this very cottage, watching her mother work among rows of herbs and flowers, with a quiet expertise Eleanor had never fully appreciated until this moment. "She taught me some things, when I was young, before I married. I had forgotten much of it, I think, buried beneath years of a different kind of life. Perhaps it is time to remember," Margaret said simply, and something in her tone suggested more than casual conversation, a genuine encouragement toward a path that might offer Eleanor both purpose and independence in equal measure. That evening, after her daughters had fallen asleep and Clara had retired to her own small room adjacent to the kitchen, Eleanor sat alone in the garden as darkness settled over Hartwell, staring up at a sky filled with more stars than she had ever noticed during her years at Ashford, where the manor's many candles and lamps had always dimmed the night sky's full brilliance. She thought of her mother, gone now for nearly 8 years, and wondered what she might think of her daughter's return to this quiet village, carrying with her 3 granddaughters her mother had never had the chance to meet. Over the following weeks, Eleanor found herself rising earlier each morning, drawn outside by the growing collection of herbs and plants she had begun cultivating in the garden behind her cottage, memories of her mother's careful instructions slowly resurfacing with each new season of tending the soil. She began modestly, offering remedies to a handful of village families who approached her tentatively, uncertain whether the former Duchess would truly be willing to provide the same practical assistance her mother once had. Eleanor welcomed each request with genuine enthusiasm, finding in this work a sense of purpose she had never experienced during her years at Ashford, where her only defined role had been to produce an heir she had ultimately failed to provide. Word of her skill spread quickly through Hartwell and into neighboring villages, aided considerably by a particular incident involving the innkeeper's youngest son, a boy of perhaps 7, who had fallen seriously ill, with a fever that seemed to worsen, despite the efforts of the local physician, an elderly man named Dr. Wren, who admitted, with unusual humility, that he had exhausted his own knowledge of possible remedies. Eleanor had visited the boy at his mother's desperate request, examined him carefully, and prepared a specific combination of herbs her mother had once used for similar symptoms, a remedy that broke the fever within 2 days and left the boy fully recovered within a week. This single success transformed Eleanor's quiet herbal practice into something the entire region began to seek out, with families traveling from villages several hours away to request her assistance for ailments ranging from simple coughs to more serious complaints that local physicians had struggled to address. Eleanor found herself, within just a few months of arriving in Hartwell, running a business that provided not only meaningful purpose, but genuine financial independence, income entirely her own, earned through her own skill and effort rather than granted or withheld at a husband's discretion, or contested by a cousin's careful maneuvering. Alice, now approaching her 6th birthday, took to accompanying her mother on visits to nearby families, watching with fascination as Eleanor examined patients and prepared remedies, asking endless questions about which plants served which purposes and why certain combinations worked better than others. Eleanor found herself teaching her eldest daughter with the same patient care her own mother had once shown her, recognizing in Alice a genuine aptitude and curiosity that suggested this knowledge might indeed pass successfully to another generation. Beatrice, meanwhile, discovered her own particular talents in the garden itself, spending hours tending to the various plants with a careful, methodical attention that impressed even Margaret, who occasionally remarked that the girl seemed to have an almost instinctive understanding of what each plant required to thrive. Charlotte, still too young for such pursuits, nonetheless spent her days happily crawling among the garden rows under Clara's watchful supervision, seemingly content with whatever simple pleasures her surroundings offered. As Eleanor's practice grew, she began setting aside a portion of her earnings, determined to build a genuine financial security for her daughters that would never depend on the goodwill or whims of any man. She corresponded regularly with Arthur Pembroke, the solicitor in Millbrook, who helped her establish proper accounts and even suggested modest investments that might grow her savings over time, providing further security for whatever future her daughters might choose to pursue once they reached adulthood. Letters from Agnes arrived every few weeks, carrying news from Ashford that Eleanor read with a complicated mixture of curiosity and detachment, grateful for information about the household she had left behind, while feeling increasingly disconnected from its concerns as her own new life took firmer shape. Agnes wrote of Vivian's growing confidence within the household, of Edmund's increasing distraction and preoccupation, and of Percival's continued quiet presence at Ashford, a presence that had begun to unsettle even the household staff, who found his constant careful observation of estate matters increasingly difficult to interpret as simple family concern. "He has taken to reviewing the tenant agreements personally," Agnes wrote in one particular letter, "a task that has traditionally fallen to the steward alone. When I asked Edmund about this, he waved away my concerns, insisting that Percival was simply making himself useful during his extended stay. I do not share his confidence. A man does not familiarize himself so thoroughly with an estate's finances and legal arrangements unless he intends, eventually, to make use of that knowledge." Eleanor read this particular letter several times, sitting in her garden as Charlotte napped nearby, and Alice and Beatrice played some elaborate game of their own invention, involving imaginary sea creatures and buried treasure. She felt a familiar unease stirring within her, though she reminded herself firmly that whatever schemes unfolded at Ashford, between Edmund and his cousin, no longer had any direct bearing on the life she was building here in Hartwell, a life that grew more secure and more genuinely hers with each passing season. She wrote back to Agnes with genuine encouragement to continue watching Percival's activities carefully, offering what limited insight she could based on her own brief observations of the man during those final tense weeks at Ashford. "He struck me as someone who calculates every action with considerable care," Eleanor wrote, "never showing his hand until the moment is precisely right for whatever he intends. I would not underestimate him, dear Agnes, however patient and unassuming he may appear on the surface." As summer deepened into autumn, Eleanor's herbal practice continued growing, and she began training 2 young women from the village, sisters named Louisa and Grace Bellwether, who showed genuine aptitude for the work, and who Eleanor hoped might eventually help expand her practice to serve an even wider region. She found unexpected satisfaction in teaching others, passing along not only practical knowledge, but also the deeper philosophy her mother had always emphasized, that healing required patience, careful observation, and genuine care for the person being treated, rather than simply following rote procedures without understanding their deeper purpose. Clara, meanwhile, had settled comfortably into her role within the household, managing the daily domestic responsibilities, while also assisting Eleanor with the herbal practice whenever additional hands were needed. She had begun a quiet friendship with a local fisherman named Henry Ashworth, a widower with a young son of his own, and though nothing had yet progressed beyond friendly conversation and occasional shared meals, Eleanor noticed the particular warmth that seemed to color Clara's expressions whenever Henry's name arose in conversation. Meanwhile, at Ashford, Vivian had grown increasingly demanding as the months progressed, insisting on changes to the household that went well beyond what any reasonable person might expect from a woman whose position remained, technically, still unofficial. She had requested that several of Eleanor's old belongings be removed entirely from the manor's storage rooms, had begun redecorating portions of the house according to her own preferences, and had made pointed comments to Edmund about ensuring that any inheritance claims from his daughters be formally and permanently severed once her own child arrived. "The girls have no place in Ashford's future," Vivian said one evening, as she and Edmund dined together in the smaller family dining room, a space that had once hosted quiet meals between Edmund and Eleanor, but now felt to Agnes, who occasionally joined them out of a sense of familial obligation, like a stage set for an entirely different and less genuine performance. Once our son is born, I think it would be wise to formally document that Alice, Beatrice, and Charlotte have no claim whatsoever to Ashford's title, lands, or resources. It would prevent any future complications. Percival, seated at the far end of the table, listened to this exchange with evident interest, though he offered no direct comment, content to let Vivian argue his own preferred outcome, without needing to press the matter himself. He had, in fact, found unexpected common ground with Vivian in recent weeks, both of them sharing an interest in seeing Eleanor's daughters formally excluded from any future claim to the estate, though for entirely different reasons. Vivian wished to secure her own child's inheritance without complication. Percival, meanwhile, understood that a formal, documented exclusion of the daughters would create exactly the kind of legal precedent he might later invoke, should Vivian's own child somehow fail to materialize as expected, arguing that the estate's succession had already been thrown into such disarray that a more distant but stable branch of the family deserved consideration. Edmund, who had grown increasingly quiet and withdrawn over recent weeks, looked up from his plate, with an expression Agnes found difficult to read. "They are still my daughters, Vivian. I do not intend to erase them entirely from existence, whatever arrangements we make regarding inheritance." Vivian's smile remained fixed and pleasant, though something calculating flickered briefly behind her eyes. "Of course not, my love. I only mean to ensure clarity for the future, so that our son's position is never called into question by any lingering ambiguity." Agnes, listening to this exchange with carefully controlled composure, felt her suspicions about Vivian's true motivations solidifying into something approaching certainty. This was not a woman motivated by genuine affection for Edmund, nor even by simple ambition for social advancement. This was a woman executing a calculated plan with a precision that suggested considerable forethought, and Agnes found herself increasingly convinced that whatever scheme Vivian had constructed, Percival's quiet encouragement of her demands served his own separate purposes entirely. That night, unable to sleep, Agnes made a decision she had been contemplating for several weeks. She would seek out Dr. Halloway directly, the physician who had been attending to Vivian's condition since its earliest weeks, and attempt to determine through careful questioning whether her growing suspicions about the entire pregnancy held any merit. She had noticed, in recent months, small inconsistencies in Vivian's account of her progress, moments where she seemed uncertain about details a genuinely pregnant woman would know instinctively, and she had begun to wonder whether Dr. Halloway himself, a physician who had arrived at Ashford under circumstances no one had ever adequately explained, might hold answers to questions she had not yet found the courage to ask directly. She arranged, through a carefully worded message delivered by a trusted footman, to meet with Dr. Halloway at a small inn along the road between Ashford and the estate where Vivian currently resided, a neutral location where their conversation would not immediately draw attention from either Edmund or Vivian's household staff, and, she hoped, far enough from Ashford that Percival's own network of informants might not immediately learn of the meeting. The physician arrived looking considerably more nervous than Agnes had anticipated, a thin, balding man whose hands trembled slightly as he removed his coat and took a seat across from her in the inn's private back room. "Dr. Halloway," Agnes began, her tone deliberately measured and calm, "I understand you have been attending to Miss Marsh's condition for several months now. I would like to understand more clearly the nature of her progress, as her well-being and that of the expected child concerns this entire family deeply." The physician shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting briefly toward the door before returning to meet Agnes's steady gaze. "Her progress has been entirely satisfactory, Your Grace. I see no cause for concern." "I see," Agnes said carefully, allowing a long pause to stretch between them before continuing. "It is curious, then, that I have received correspondence from acquaintances in London who recall a physician matching your description, though under a somewhat different name, associated with certain cases involving falsified certificates for families seeking particular outcomes regarding matters of birth and inheritance. Perhaps you might help me understand whether these accounts refer to the same person sitting before me now." The color drained visibly from Dr. Halloway's face, and his hands, already trembling, began shaking more noticeably as he reached for the glass of water the innkeeper had provided upon their arrival. "I do not know what you are suggesting, Your Grace," he said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier composure. "I am suggesting nothing, Doctor," Agnes replied evenly. "I am simply asking questions." and I would strongly encourage you to consider carefully how you answer them. This family has already suffered considerable disruption and pain. If you have been complicit in some scheme to deceive my grandson regarding the nature of Miss Marsh's condition, I would urge you to consider the consequences of continuing that deception, both for yourself and for everyone else involved. Dr. Holloway sat in tense silence for several long moments, his eyes fixed on the table before him, before finally speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. I cannot discuss the specifics of my patient's condition without her consent, Your Grace. Professional discretion requires as much. Then I will ask you a different question, Agnes said, leaning forward slightly. Is Miss Marsh, in fact, currently expecting a child at all? The silence that followed this question stretched long enough that Agnes began to believe she would receive no answer whatsoever, but eventually, Dr. Holloway raised his eyes to meet hers, and in his expression, she read something that confirmed her worst suspicions, even before he spoke another word. I have said too much already, Your Grace, he murmured, rising quickly from his seat. I must attend to other matters. I would ask that you not mention this conversation to anyone, particularly not to Miss Marsh, the Duke, or Mr. Hartley. The mention of Percival's name, offered unprompted, struck Agnes as significant, and she wondered, as she watched the physician hurry from the inn without further explanation, whether Percival's careful observation of the household extended even to knowledge of Vivian's deception, knowledge he might be holding in reserve for whatever moment would serve his purposes best. She returned to Ashford that evening, deeply troubled, uncertain how to proceed, without concrete proof that might convince Edmund, whose judgment had grown so clouded by his desperate desire for a son that he seemed unwilling to entertain any suggestion that might complicate his current plans. She considered writing immediately to Eleanor, sharing everything she had learned, but decided instead to gather additional evidence before involving her further, unwilling to raise false hopes without something more definitive to offer. Over the following weeks, Agnes began quietly observing Vivian with renewed attention, noting small details that had previously escaped her notice. The way Vivian occasionally forgot which month of her supposed pregnancy she claimed to be in. The way she avoided any physician other than Dr. Holloway. The way she grew visibly anxious whenever conversations turned toward specific plans for the child's arrival, insisting always that such details remained premature to discuss. She also began making more careful inquiries among the household staff at the estate where Vivian resided, discovering through careful and patient conversation with a young maid named Susanna that Vivian had, on more than one occasion, been observed lacing her corset in ways that seemed designed to create the appearance of a growing belly, rather than accommodate one that occurred naturally. Susanna, initially reluctant to share such observations for fear of losing her position, eventually confided in Agnes after being assured of complete confidentiality and a promise of continued employment, regardless of whatever conclusions emerged from this investigation. Susanna also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Mr. Hartley had visited Vivian privately on several occasions when the Duke was away from the estate, conversations that always ended abruptly whenever a servant approached, and that on one such occasion, she had overheard Vivian assuring Percival that their arrangement would benefit them both handsomely once matters had been properly settled. Agnes absorbed this new information with a growing sense of alarm, understanding now that whatever deception Vivian had constructed, Percival was likely far more deeply involved than simple opportunistic observation from the sidelines. Armed with this growing body of circumstantial evidence, Agnes finally decided the time had come to share her suspicions with Edmund directly, understanding the risk involved, but recognizing that continued silence would only allow whatever scheme Vivian and Percival had constructed together to progress further toward whatever conclusion they ultimately intended. She requested a private audience with her grandson on a cold evening in late autumn, the fireplace in his study crackling loudly against the silence that stretched between them, as she prepared to share information she knew would fundamentally alter his understanding of the choices he had made. Edmund, she began carefully, I have something important to discuss with you, something I believe you need to hear, however difficult it may be to accept. Edmund looked up from the papers scattered across his desk, his expression tired and increasingly strained, in ways Agnes had noticed accumulating over recent weeks. What is it, grandmother? I have a great deal to attend to this evening. I believe, Agnes said slowly, choosing her words with careful precision, that Miss Marsh may not be entirely honest with you regarding the true nature of her condition. I have gathered considerable evidence over recent weeks that suggests her pregnancy may not be genuine, and that Dr. Holloway, the physician you have entrusted with her care, has a history of assisting families in fabricating such conditions for their own benefit. I have further reason to believe that Percival may be aware of this deception, and perhaps even complicit in encouraging it, given certain conversations a member of Miss Marsh's household staff has confided to me directly. Edmund's face went through a rapid series of expressions, disbelief giving way to anger, then confusion, then something that resembled genuine fear, as the implications of Agnes's words began settling over him. "That is impossible," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "I have seen her condition myself. She grows larger with each passing month, and Percival has been nothing but supportive throughout this entire process, offering counsel and assistance whenever I have needed it." "I understand your skepticism," Agnes replied gently, "but I would ask you to consider the evidence carefully before dismissing it entirely. Would you be willing to arrange a proper medical examination, conducted by a physician of unquestionable reputation, someone with no prior connection to Dr. Holloway, Miss Marsh, or your cousin, to confirm the true nature of her condition once and for all?" Edmund sat in stunned silence for several long minutes, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth before him, his mind clearly working through the implications of what his grandmother had just suggested. He thought of Percival's constant presence these past months, his careful counsel that always seemed to steer toward formalizing arrangements, documenting decisions, and severing his daughter's claims permanently. Counsel that Edmund had accepted as reasonable caution from a concerned family member, rather than the calculated maneuvering of a man with his own interests at stake. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "If what you say is true, grandmother, then I have made a terrible mistake, one that cannot easily be undone." "Many mistakes can still be corrected, Edmund," Agnes said quietly, "if they are recognized before it becomes too late to change course. But you must be willing to face the truth first, however painful that truth might prove to be." Edmund did not sleep that night, pacing the length of his study, long after Agnes had retired to her own chambers, turning over every detail of the past several months in his mind, searching for signs he had perhaps ignored, in his eagerness to believe what he desperately wanted to be true. He thought of the vague explanations Vivian had offered whenever he asked specific questions about her condition, the way she always deflected concerns about consulting additional physicians, the manner in which she had grown increasingly insistent about formalizing arrangements regarding his daughter's inheritance, well before any child had actually arrived, to justify such urgency. And he thought, with a growing sense of unease, of every piece of advice Percival had offered throughout these months, advice that had always, in hindsight, pointed toward outcomes that benefited his cousin, regardless of whether Vivian's child proved real or not. By morning, he had made his decision. He sent a carefully worded message to a physician in London whose reputation for honesty and skill was beyond question, a man named Dr. Fitzgerald, who had no prior connection to anyone within the Ashford household, and who could be trusted to provide an entirely objective assessment. He requested that the physician travel to the estate where Vivian resided, under the pretense of a routine examination, without revealing the specific concerns that had prompted this sudden request, and without informing Percival of his plans, a small precaution that struck him, even as he arranged it, as a troubling admission of how deeply his trust in his cousin had already begun to erode. When Dr. Fitzgerald arrived 3 days later, Edmund accompanied him personally to Vivian's estate, watching her reaction carefully as he introduced the unfamiliar physician and explained that he wished for a second opinion regarding her progress, purely as a precaution, given the importance of ensuring everything proceeded correctly for the child's arrival. Vivian's composure, usually so carefully maintained, flickered visibly at this announcement, her eyes darting toward Dr. Holloway, who stood nearby, looking considerably more nervous than the situation should have warranted. "There is truly no need for additional examinations, Edmund," Vivian said, her voice carrying a forced lightness that did not quite mask the underlying tension. "Dr. Holloway has managed my care perfectly well throughout this entire process." "Humor me, my dear," Edmund replied, his tone carefully neutral despite the storm of emotions churning beneath his composed exterior. "I simply wish to ensure everything proceeds as it should. Surely you would not object to additional care and attention during such an important time." Vivian had little choice but to comply, given the audience of household staff and the physician himself already present and waiting. though her reluctance was palpable to everyone in the room. Dr. Fitzgerald requested a private room for his examination, and Vivian, with visible hesitation, led him toward her chambers, while Edmund waited in the adjoining sitting room, his heart pounding with an anxiety he had not experienced in years. The examination took considerably longer than Edmund had anticipated, and when Dr. Fitzgerald finally emerged, his expression carried the careful neutrality of a professional delivering difficult news. "Your Grace," he said quietly, drawing Edmund aside from the assembled household staff who had gathered curiously near the sitting room. "I must speak with you privately regarding my findings." They retreated to a small study down the hall, and once the door had closed behind them, Dr. Fitzgerald delivered his assessment with the directness Edmund had specifically requested. "Your Grace, Miss Marsh is not, and as far as I can determine from my examination, has never been pregnant. The appearance of increased size around her midsection appears to be the result of carefully constructed padding beneath her clothing, rather than any genuine physical condition." Edmund stood in stunned silence, the words settling over him like a physical weight, confirming every fear that Agnes's earlier revelations had planted within him, but that he had still hoped, against mounting evidence, might prove unfounded. "Are you certain of this assessment, Doctor?" "Entirely certain, Your Grace. I have examined countless women throughout various stages of pregnancy, and I can say with complete confidence that Miss Marsh shows no physical signs consistent with the condition she has claimed for these past several months." Edmund thanked the physician mechanically, his mind reeling with the implications of this revelation, before returning to the sitting room, where Vivian waited with an expression that had shifted from forced pleasantness to something more calculating, as though she sensed the ground shifting beneath the careful scheme she had constructed. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice tight, with barely concealed anxiety. "I think you know exactly what he said, Vivian," Edmund replied, his voice cold in a way that surprised even himself. A coldness born not of the calculated cruelty he had once directed toward Eleanor, but of genuine betrayal and disappointment at discovering the extent to which he had been manipulated by someone he had genuinely believed cared for him. "Dr. Fitzgerald has confirmed what my grandmother suspected weeks ago. You have never been pregnant at all." Vivian's carefully maintained composure finally shattered entirely, tears springing to her eyes, though Edmund found himself unable to determine whether they represented genuine emotion or simply another calculated performance, designed to salvage whatever remained of her position. "Edmund, please, let me explain. I only wanted to secure my place beside you, to ensure you would not abandon me the way you abandoned Eleanor. I feared that without the promise of a child, I would eventually lose your affection entirely." "And Percival?" Edmund demanded, his voice rising for the first time. "What role has my cousin played in this deception?" Dr. Halloway mentioned his name unprompted when my grandmother questioned him. "I want the truth, Vivian, all of it, or I promise you the consequences will be far worse than anything you currently fear." Vivian hesitated, calculation flickering visibly behind her tears as she weighed her rapidly narrowing options. "He knew," she admitted finally, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "He guessed the truth months ago, and rather than exposing me, he offered to help maintain the deception, provided I supported his own efforts to convince you toward formally severing your daughter's claims to the estate. He believed that whether my child proved real or not, a documented exclusion of Alice, Beatrice, and Charlotte would serve his interests regardless of how matters ultimately unfolded, and he calculated that my silence about his knowledge was a fair price for his continued discretion about my deception." Edmund felt something cold and furious settle in his chest at this revelation, understanding now the full extent of the manipulation both Vivian and his own cousin had woven around him over these past months, each pursuing separate but complementary schemes, while he remained blind to all of it, consumed entirely by his own desperate desire for a son. "I want you to leave this estate immediately," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I will provide sufficient funds to ensure you are not left entirely destitute, though far less than what you clearly hope to secure through this deception. But I never wish to see you again, and if I learn that you have spoken of this arrangement to anyone, in a manner that further damages my family's reputation, I will ensure the full truth of your deception becomes public knowledge throughout every social circle that matters to you." Vivian's tears stopped abruptly, her expression hardening into something colder and more calculating, as she recognized that further pleading would serve no purpose. "You will regret this, Edmund," You have already lost your wife and daughters through your own foolish pride. Now you have lost me as well, and you will spend the rest of your days alone with nothing but your precious title and empty halls to keep you company." "Perhaps," Edmund replied quietly, "but at least I will no longer be living a lie, constructed by someone who never genuinely cared for anything beyond her own advancement, nor guided by a cousin whose counsel served his own ambitions far more than my family's genuine welfare." He returned to Ashford that same evening, in a state of controlled fury, finding Percival in the study exactly where he had expected, reviewing some ledger or another with his usual unhurried composure. "Percival," Edmund said, his voice carrying a coldness that made his cousin look up sharply from his papers, "I know everything. Vivian has confessed the full extent of your involvement in her deception, and your willingness to trade your silence for her support of your own schemes regarding my daughter's inheritance." For the first time since his arrival at Ashford months earlier, Percival's careful composure showed genuine strain, though he recovered quickly, setting down his pen with deliberate calm. "I do not know what she has told you, Edmund, but I assure you my only concern has ever been the stability of this family's affairs." "Do not insult me further with such transparent falsehoods," Edmund said sharply. "You knew Vivian's pregnancy was fabricated, and rather than telling me the truth, you chose to use that knowledge to advance your own position, encouraging me toward decisions that served your interests rather than my family's welfare. I want you gone from Ashford by morning, Percival, and I want you to understand clearly that any future attempt to interfere with my daughter's rightful position within this family will be met with the full resources this estate can bring to bear against you." Percival studied his cousin for a long moment, some calculation clearly working behind his careful expression, before finally rising and gathering his papers with the same unhurried grace that had characterized his entire stay. "You are making a mistake, Edmund, dismissing family in favor of daughters who cannot even inherit, under the terms of your father's will. But I will not argue the point further tonight. Good evening, cousin." He departed the following morning, without further confrontation, and though Agnes remained watchful for any further attempts at interference in the months that followed, Percival's direct influence over Ashford's affairs effectively ended that same cold autumn evening, leaving Edmund alone to reckon with the full weight of the mistakes his own pride and desperate ambitions had caused. News of Vivian's fabricated pregnancy did not remain contained within Ashford's walls for long, despite Edmund's private hopes that the matter might be resolved quietly. Within a fortnight, whispers had spread through every drawing room and dinner party across the county, carried by servants who had witnessed the departure of both Vivian and Dr. Halloway, and by guests who had attended the original announcement and now delighted in discussing its scandalous unraveling with anyone willing to listen. Percival's own hasty departure from Ashford so soon after these events did not escape notice either, and several of the more perceptive members of local society began quietly speculating about his role in the entire affair, though none possessed enough concrete information to voice such suspicions openly. Lord Aldridge, the family friend who had first questioned the wisdom of Edmund's public announcement, found himself in the curious position of having his earlier warnings vindicated in the most dramatic fashion possible, though he took no particular satisfaction in being proven correct, given the genuine pain the entire situation had caused. He visited Ashford shortly after the truth became widely known, finding Edmund considerably humbled compared to the confident, almost arrogant man who had made that fateful announcement months earlier. "I do not envy your position, Edmund," Lord Aldridge said as they sat together in the study, the fire crackling softly against the autumn chill outside. "The gossip networks of our society can be merciless, and I fear you will carry this particular scandal for some time yet, regardless of how genuinely you seek to make amends. I understand your cousin has also departed rather abruptly. He had involved himself more deeply in this deception than I initially realized," Edmund admitted quietly. "I have since learned that Vivian is not the only person who spent these past months working to shape my decisions toward outcomes that served interests other than my own family's genuine welfare." Lord Aldridge nodded slowly, unsurprised by this revelation. "Percival has always been a patient man, Edmund. I remember your father remarking once, years ago, that his cousin possessed the temperament of a man content to wait a lifetime for a single opportunity, provided the eventual reward justified the wait. I suspect you have not seen the last of him, whatever face-saving departure he made from your household this past week." "What do you mean?" Edmund asked, a fresh wariness entering his voice. only that men like Percival rarely abandon a long-held ambition, simply because one particular avenue toward it has closed, Lord Aldridge replied. He may well seek other means of pressing whatever claim he believes he holds to this family's title and lands, particularly if he can construct some argument that your judgment, demonstrated so publicly through this entire scandal, renders you unfit to manage Ashford's affairs without more direct oversight from a more stable branch of the family. I would advise you to remain vigilant and to ensure your own affairs are documented and defended at least as carefully as he has clearly documented his own position over these past months. Edmund absorbed this warning with the same quiet reflection that had characterized his behavior since the revelation of Vivienne's deception, understanding that whatever amends he hoped to make regarding his treatment of Eleanor and his daughters, he would also need to remain alert to whatever further schemes his cousin might attempt, from whatever distance he now operated. He resolved, in the days that followed, to consult more carefully with Arthur Pembroke's counterpart in London regarding the precise legal standing of his daughter's potential claims, determined that whatever Percival attempted in the future, he would find Edmund considerably better prepared than he had been during these past difficult months. Meanwhile, in Hartwell, Eleanor received word of the unfolding scandal through a lengthy letter from Agnes that arrived on a crisp autumn morning, delivered by a rider who had traveled specifically to ensure the news reached her promptly, rather than waiting for the slower postal routes that typically connected the coastal village to the wider world. Eleanor read the letter twice through, sitting in her garden while Clara tended to Charlotte nearby, and Alice and Beatrice attended their morning lessons with a tutor Eleanor had recently engaged from a neighboring town. The revelation that Vivienne's pregnancy had been entirely fabricated and that Percival had known of the deception and used it to advance his own separate ambitions stirred a complicated mixture of emotions within Eleanor, vindication mingling with a lingering sadness for the pain and public humiliation the entire situation had caused, and a wariness about what this development might mean for her own carefully constructed new life. She had built something genuine and independent in Hartwell, something that owed nothing to Edmund or his family's fortunes, and she felt a protective instinct rising within her at the thought that this scandal, and Percival's lingering ambitions, might somehow disrupt the peace she and her daughters had finally found. She wrote back to Agnes that same evening, expressing genuine sympathy for the pain this revelation had undoubtedly caused throughout the household, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that this news changed her own feelings toward Edmund or her plans for the future. I am relieved that the truth has finally emerged, she wrote, if only because it means no innocent child will suffer the consequences of being caught between a father who wanted him only for his usefulness and a mother who fabricated his very existence for her own advancement. But I would ask you to understand, dear Agnes, that this revelation does not undo the pain Edmund caused my daughters and myself through his own choices he made freely and without any deception clouding his judgment at the time. I am concerned too about Percival. Do you believe he might still attempt some claim against the girls, now that his presence at Ashford has ended? Agnes's response arrived within the week, gentle but honest in acknowledging the complexity of the situation. I understand completely, my dear, and I would never presume to suggest that Edmund's genuine culpability in this matter is somehow diminished by Vivienne's separate deception or by Percival's opportunistic exploitation of it. He chose, of his own free will, to humiliate you publicly and abandon his daughters based on nothing more than his own prejudices about the value of female children. As for Percival, Edmund has already begun consulting more carefully with legal counsel in London to ensure your daughter's position is documented as thoroughly and defensibly as possible, precisely because we share your concern that Percival will not simply abandon his ambitions after one setback. I will keep you informed of any further developments on that front, though I do not wish to burden you unnecessarily with concerns that may never come to anything. This last observation, along with a further note Agnes had added regarding Edmund's apparent intention to eventually seek Eleanor out directly, troubled Eleanor more than she initially wished to admit, and she found herself, over the following days, increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of how she might respond should Edmund actually appear at her door seeking some form of reconciliation, and how she might protect her daughters should Percival ever attempt to press whatever claim he still believed himself entitled to pursue. She discussed the matter with Clara one evening after the children had gone to sleep, seeking the perspective of someone who had witnessed both the cruelty of their departure from Ashford and the genuine happiness they had subsequently built in Hartwell. Clara asked, setting aside the mending she had been working on to give Eleanor her full attention. I do not know, Eleanor admitted. Part of me hopes he does not, simply because I do not wish to disrupt the peace we have found here, with whatever complicated emotions his presence would inevitably stir. But another part of me recognizes that our daughters deserve the opportunity to know their father, should he genuinely wish to be part of their lives going forward, rather than simply reappearing out of guilt, only to disappear again once the social scandal has faded from memory. And I confess I worry too about this cousin of his. If he still believes some claim remains available to him, I would rather understand the full shape of that danger now than be caught unprepared later. You have built something remarkable here, Your Grace, Clara said, using the title out of habit, despite months of increasingly informal familiarity between them. Whatever Edmund's intentions, and whatever his cousin still hopes to gain, you owe them nothing. You have already given your daughters a life filled with love and purpose, entirely independent of anything Ashford could offer them. Eleanor smiled at her friend's fierce loyalty, grateful beyond measure for the support Clara had provided throughout this entire journey. You are right, of course, but I find myself wanting to at least hear what Edmund might have to say, if only to finally close this particular chapter of our story with genuine understanding, rather than lingering uncertainty about what might have been, and to ensure, once and for all, that our daughters' futures remain secure from whatever ambitions his cousin continues to harbor. As autumn deepened toward winter, Eleanor continued building her herbal practice, now assisted regularly by Louisa and Grace Bellwether, who had progressed considerably in their training and had begun taking on increasing responsibility for treating patients throughout the region. Alice, now approaching her 7th birthday, had developed genuine skill in identifying various herbs and their properties, often accompanying her mother on visits to nearby farms and cottages, where families sought treatment for various ailments. Beatrice had discovered a particular talent for illustration, spending hours sketching the various plants growing in their garden with remarkable detail and precision for a child of her age, filling notebook after notebook with careful drawings that Eleanor began considering might eventually form the foundation of a proper reference guide to the region's medicinal plants. Charlotte, now walking steadily and beginning to form her first proper words, brought a constant source of joy and amusement to the household, her cheerful disposition seemingly untouched by any of the complicated circumstances that had brought her family to this coastal village, or by whatever distant maneuvering continued unfolding around the family name she had inherited but never truly known. It was on a particularly cold morning in early winter, frost coating the garden's remaining plants and smoke curling steadily from the cottage's chimney, that Nathaniel arrived unannounced at Eleanor's door, having traveled from Ashford with a message that required, according to his careful explanation, her immediate personal attention rather than simple written correspondence. Your Grace, he said, removing his hat respectfully, as Eleanor greeted him at the threshold, surprised by his sudden appearance after months without direct contact. The Duke has asked that I deliver this message personally, and to await your response before returning to Ashford. Eleanor took the sealed letter with hands that trembled slightly, understanding immediately what its contents likely contained, given everything Agnes had shared in recent weeks about the unfolding scandal and Edmund's apparent intention to eventually seek reconciliation. She thanked Nathaniel and asked Clara to see him settled comfortably in the kitchen with warm refreshments while she retreated to her private sitting room to read whatever message Edmund had finally chosen to send her way. Eleanor sat alone in her small sitting room, the letter unopened in her lap for several long minutes, as she gathered the courage to break the wax seal bearing the Ashford crest, a symbol that had once defined so much of her existence and now felt strangely distant, belonging to a life she had left behind with such deliberate finality nearly a year earlier. Finally, she opened it, and Edmund's familiar handwriting, though somehow less confident than she remembered, filled the page before her. Eleanor, the letter began, without any of the formal titles or pretensions that might once have characterized his correspondence. I do not know how to begin this letter, having spent countless hours attempting various openings, none of which felt adequate to express the genuine remorse I carry for how I treated you and our daughters. I have learned, in recent weeks, the full extent of the deception Vivian constructed to secure her position within my household, and the equally troubling extent to which my own cousin Percival exploited that deception for his separate ambitions regarding this family's title and succession. While these revelations have certainly reshaped my understanding of certain events, I want to be absolutely clear that I do not write to you now seeking sympathy based on having been deceived myself. My own choices, made freely and without any coercion, caused you and our daughters genuine pain, and no subsequent revelation about Vivian's dishonesty or Percival's scheming changes the fundamental cruelty of my original actions. Eleanor read this opening with cautious surprise, having expected perhaps more self-justification or attempts to shift blame onto Vivian's manipulation or Percival's ambitions, rather than this direct acknowledgement of his own culpability. She continued reading, her heart beating slightly faster as the letter progressed. I understand that I have no right to expect forgiveness, and I certainly have no right to expect that you would welcome my presence back into your life, or the lives of our daughters, after everything I have done. But I find myself unable to simply continue as though nothing has changed, unable to accept that my daughters should grow up believing their father abandoned them entirely, without any attempt at genuine amends. I do not ask for reconciliation in the sense of restoring our marriage, understanding fully that such a restoration may be neither possible nor desirable given everything that has transpired. I ask only for the opportunity to speak with you directly, to offer whatever apology might carry genuine meaning after such profound betrayal, and perhaps, if you would permit it, to begin some small process of knowing my daughters as the people they are becoming, rather than remaining a distant, disgraced figure from their earliest memories. The letter continued for several more paragraphs, detailing the specific consequences Edmund had faced within his social circles, the careful legal steps he had already begun taking to formally secure his daughter's inheritance rights against any future challenge Percival might attempt to construct, and the genuine reflection he claimed to have undertaken regarding his own prejudices about the value of daughters versus sons. He closed with a careful, humble request that Eleanor consider allowing him to visit Hartwell, at whatever time might prove convenient for her, to discuss these matters in person, rather than through the necessarily limited medium of written correspondence. Eleanor set the letter down and sat in quiet contemplation for a long while, watching the frost patterns on her window catch the pale winter sunlight, turning over the various emotions this unexpected correspondence had stirred within her. She felt no particular anger at Edmund's request, having moved beyond the rawest edges of her hurt in the months since their departure from Ashford. But she also felt no immediate rush toward forgiveness or reconciliation, understanding that genuine trust, once so thoroughly broken, could not simply be restored through a single well-composed letter, however genuine its sentiments appeared. She thought carefully about her daughters, about Alice's occasional questions regarding whether their father ever thought of them, about Beatrice's quiet observation that she no longer missed him as she once had, about Charlotte, who had no memories of him whatsoever given how young she had been when they departed Ashford. Whatever her own feelings toward Edmund, she recognized that her daughters deserved the opportunity to form their own understanding of their father, rather than having that understanding shaped entirely by her own justified but potentially limiting perspective on his previous cruelty. That evening, she discussed the matter with Clara, sharing the contents of Edmund's letter and seeking her friend's honest perspective on how to proceed. "What do you think I should do?" Eleanor asked, genuinely uncertain, despite having spent considerable time already weighing the various considerations involved. "I think," Clara said carefully, "that you have built something remarkable here, something that does not require Edmund's presence or approval to remain genuine and lasting. Whatever you decide, that foundation will not be disturbed. But I also think your daughters are curious about their father, whatever complicated feelings they might carry alongside that curiosity, and perhaps allowing them the opportunity to form their own understanding of him, under your careful guidance and protection, might serve them better in the long run than permanent, unexplained absence." Eleanor nodded slowly, appreciating her friend's thoughtful perspective. "I think I agree. I will write back to him, inviting him to visit, though I intend to set clear expectations about what such a visit might accomplish, and what it certainly will not accomplish, particularly regarding any hopes he might harbor about restoring our marriage." She spent the following 2 days composing her response, writing and rewriting various passages until she felt satisfied that her letter conveyed both the genuine openness she wished to extend toward her daughter's relationship with their father and the firm boundaries she intended to maintain regarding her own independence and the life she had built, separate from Ashford's title and legacy. "Edmund," she wrote in her final draft, "I have considered your letter carefully, and I am willing to allow you to visit Hartwell, to speak with me directly, and to meet with our daughters, should you genuinely wish to begin building some form of relationship with them going forward. I want to be entirely clear, however, that this invitation extends only to the possibility of you knowing your daughters as they grow, and does not indicate any willingness on my part to consider restoring our marriage or returning to Ashford in any capacity. I have built a genuine, independent life here in Hartwell, one that I value deeply and have no intention of abandoning, regardless of whatever changes have occurred in your own circumstances. I would also ask that you keep me informed of any further developments regarding Percival's ambitions, as I wish to understand fully whatever risks might still exist to our daughter's security, wherever they eventually choose to make their own lives. If you can accept these terms, I welcome your visit. If you cannot, I would ask that you respect my decision to maintain the distance we have established over this past year. She sent the letter with Nathaniel, when he returned to Ashford several days later, and then settled into the familiar rhythm of waiting, uncertain exactly when Edmund might arrive, or how her daughters might react to finally meeting the father whose absence had shaped so much of their recent lives, even as they had built genuine happiness independent of his presence. The response came more quickly than Eleanor had anticipated, a brief note confirming that Edmund would travel to Hartwell within the fortnight, accompanied by Agnes, who had apparently insisted on joining the journey both to see Eleanor and her granddaughters after so many months of separation, and to provide Edmund with support and perspective as he navigated whatever difficult conversations awaited him upon arrival. The note also included a brief but reassuring update regarding Percival, whose attempt to formally petition a distant court for consideration as an alternative heir, made quietly some weeks after his departure from Ashford, had been dismissed outright once Edmund's newly strengthened legal documentation demonstrated clearly that no genuine crisis of succession existed, given that Edmund remained in good health and had, in fact, formally and irrevocably confirmed his daughter's standing within the family, regardless of any future marriage or children he might have. Eleanor read this particular detail with genuine relief, understanding that whatever complicated feelings remained between herself and Edmund, he had at least followed through on his stated intention to protect their daughters from whatever ambitions his cousin continued to harbor. She found herself, for the first time since receiving his initial letter, feeling something closer to cautious respect for the changes Edmund appeared to be genuinely undertaking, rather than simple wariness about whatever motives might still lurk beneath his carefully worded apologies. In the days leading up to their planned arrival, Eleanor found herself explaining the situation carefully to Alice and Beatrice, choosing her words with deliberate care to avoid either painting an unfairly harsh picture of their father or offering false reassurance about what his visit might ultimately mean for their family's future. "Your father is coming to visit," she told them one evening as they sat together before the fire, Charlotte already asleep in her small bed nearby. "He wishes to see you, to begin knowing you as the wonderful girls you are becoming. But I want you to understand that this visit does not mean we will be returning to Ashford, or that our lives here in Hartwell will change in any significant way. Whatever relationship you choose to build with your father, at whatever pace feels comfortable to you, our home remains here, and our lives remain our own." Alice absorbed this explanation with her characteristic seriousness, asking several thoughtful questions about what she might say to her father, whether he had changed from the man who had once ignored her existence in favor of hoping for a son, and whether the cousin she vaguely remembered watching her from across the great hall on the night of her sister's birth still posed any danger to their family. Eleanor answered each question as honestly as she could, reassuring her eldest daughter that whatever uncertainty remained about the future, she and her sisters were safe, and that their mother would ensure that safety continued, regardless of whatever anyone else attempted. Beatrice remained quieter, though Eleanor noticed her daughter spending extra time in the garden over the following days, as though seeking comfort in the familiar routines that had come to define their new life together. As the appointed day of Edmund's arrival approached, Eleanor found herself experiencing a curious mixture of calm and anticipation, grateful for the year of independence and healing that had allowed her to face this reunion, not from a place of desperate need or lingering hurt, but from a position of genuine strength and self-assurance that no amount of apology or reconciliation could fundamentally alter. The carriage bearing Edmund and Agnes arrived in Hartwell on a clear, cold afternoon in early winter, the kind of day when the sea beyond the cliffs shone a brilliant, almost impossible blue, beneath a sky scrubbed clean of clouds by the previous night's wind. Eleanor watched from her cottage window as the unfamiliar carriage made its way along the village road, her heart beating faster than she wished to admit despite the many days she had spent preparing herself for this precise moment. Alice, sensing the significance of the arrival, positioned herself near the window beside her mother, watching the carriage's approach with wide, curious eyes, while Beatrice remained near the fireplace, ostensibly occupied with one of her sketchbooks, though Eleanor noticed her daughter's attention repeatedly drifting toward the window despite her efforts to appear unconcerned. Clara kept Charlotte occupied in the kitchen, understanding that the youngest daughter's introduction to her father would require careful handling given her complete lack of memory regarding him. When the carriage finally stopped before the cottage's small gate, Eleanor stepped outside to meet her visitors, drawing her shawl close against the winter chill, as Nathaniel helped first Agnes, then Edmund, down from the carriage. Agnes moved forward immediately, embracing Eleanor with genuine warmth that spoke to the friendship that had developed between them over the past year, despite their limited direct contact. "You look wonderful, my dear," Agnes said, holding Eleanor at arm's length to study her more carefully. "This life clearly suits you." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, genuine affection coloring her voice as she returned the older woman's embrace. "I am so glad you have come." She turned then, to face Edmund, who stood somewhat awkwardly near the carriage, seemingly uncertain how to proceed, given the complicated history between them, and the genuine uncertainty about what reception he might receive. He looked different than she remembered, thinner perhaps, with new lines around his eyes that suggested the past year had weighed on him considerably, despite the comfortable circumstances of his continued position as Duke. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "thank you for allowing me to come." "You may come inside," Eleanor said, her tone carefully neutral, neither warm nor overtly cold, simply matter of fact, in a way that established immediately the terms under which this visit would proceed. "The girls are waiting to meet you, or to see you again, in Alice and Beatrice's case, though I imagine they will not remember much of their earliest years at Ashford." Edmund followed her inside, removing his coat and hat with careful, almost nervous precision, glancing around the modest cottage with an expression that Eleanor found difficult to read, though she noted no trace of the disdain she might once have expected from a man so accustomed to the grandeur of Ashford Manor. If anything, his expression carried something closer to genuine appreciation for the warmth and comfort evident throughout the small home, from the carefully tended plants visible through the kitchen window to the children's drawings pinned along one wall of the sitting room. Alice stood near the fireplace, studying her father with the same serious concentration she brought to most matters, and Edmund crouched down slightly to bring himself to her eye level, his voice gentle in a way Eleanor had rarely heard him use during their years together at Ashford. "Hello, Alice. I do not know if you remember me, but I am your father. I have thought of you often, though I know that thinking of you is not the same as being present in your life, and I am sorry for that absence." Alice studied him for a long moment, before responding with the directness that characterized so much of her personality. "Mother says you thought girls could not be as good as boys. Is that true?" Edmund's expression flickered with genuine pain at this direct question, and he took a moment to formulate his response with obvious care. "It was true, Alice, and it was wrong of me to believe such a thing. You and your sisters have shown me, even from this distance, through the stories your grandmother has shared, that girls can accomplish anything boys can accomplish, and that the value of a person has nothing to do with whether they were born a son or a daughter. I made a terrible mistake in believing otherwise, and I am deeply sorry for the pain that mistake caused you and your sisters." Alice considered this answer with evident thoughtfulness before nodding slowly, apparently satisfied, at least for the moment, with the sincerity of her father's response. Beatrice, watching this exchange from her position near the fireplace, finally spoke up in her characteristically quiet voice. "Do you know that Alice can identify 12 different herbs now, and I have drawn pictures of all of them?" Edmund turned toward his middle daughter, with genuine interest lighting his expression. "I would love to see your drawings, if you would be willing to show me." Beatrice hesitated only a moment before retrieving her sketchbook and presenting it somewhat shyly to her father, who examined each careful illustration with what appeared to be genuine appreciation and curiosity, asking thoughtful questions about specific plants and their properties that suggested more than polite pretense at interest. Eleanor watched this interaction with cautious optimism, recognizing in her daughter's careful but not entirely closed-off responses the possibility that some form of relationship with their father might indeed develop over time, provided he continued demonstrating this same genuine engagement rather than the distant indifference that had characterized his behavior during their earliest years. Charlotte, brought in from the kitchen by Clara once the initial introductions had settled into more comfortable conversation, regarded her father with the open curiosity of a child too young to carry any complicated history or lingering resentment. Edmund knelt down to greet her, and though she initially clung shyly to Clara's skirts, she eventually allowed him to hold her small hand, studying his face with the frank assessment particular to very young children encountering someone new. "She has your eyes," Edmund said quietly, looking up at Eleanor with an expression that carried genuine emotion, perhaps the first moment since his arrival, where his careful composure showed clear signs of strain. "I am sorry I was not present to watch her grow these past months. I am sorry I was not present for so much of what has happened in all of your lives." Eleanor felt her own careful composure wavering slightly at the genuine sorrow evident in his voice, though she maintained her measured tone as she responded. "You made your choices, Edmund, based on your own priorities at the time. I do not say this to wound you further, but simply to acknowledge the reality of what happened. What matters now is what choices you make going forward, and whether those choices demonstrate genuine, sustained commitment to knowing your daughters, rather than a temporary burst of guilt-driven remorse that fades once the scandal surrounding Vivian's deception settles into the past." Edmund nodded, accepting this assessment without argument. "I understand your caution, Eleanor, and I do not expect you to simply trust my intentions based on words alone. I am prepared to demonstrate through consistent action, over whatever time period proves necessary, that my commitment to knowing my daughters is genuine and lasting." They spent the remainder of the afternoon in careful, gradually warming conversation, with Agnes providing occasional gentle guidance whenever the discussion grew too tense or uncertain, clearly relieved to see the beginnings of what might eventually become a genuine, if necessarily limited, relationship between Edmund and his daughters. As evening approached, Margaret Fairweather arrived at the cottage with a basket of fresh bread and a curious but kind expression, having heard through the village that the Duchess was hosting important visitors and wishing to ensure the family had everything they needed for a proper evening meal. "You must be the Duke," Margaret said plainly, studying Edmund with the same frank assessment the entire village seemed to bring to any matter concerning Eleanor's welfare. "I knew Eleanor's mother well, many years ago. She was a woman of remarkable strength, and I have watched her daughter build something equally remarkable in this village since her arrival. I hope you understand what a rare thing you very nearly lost." Edmund accepted this pointed observation with quiet humility. "I understand it better with each passing day, Mrs. Fairweather. I hope, in time, to prove myself worthy of whatever small place in my daughters' lives they are willing to grant me." That evening, as the family gathered around Eleanor's modest table for a dinner considerably enlivened by Margaret's contributions, Edmund found himself listening with genuine fascination as Alice described, in considerable detail, the process of identifying a particular herb used for treating fever, while Beatrice contributed occasional corrections regarding the precise shade of green that distinguished the plant from a similar, but far less effective variety. Agnes watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction, exchanging a brief, knowing glance with Eleanor across the table that spoke volumes about how far this family had traveled from that cold night in the birthing chamber years earlier. Their peaceful evening was interrupted, however, by an unexpected knock at the cottage door just as Clara began clearing the dinner plates. Nathaniel, who had been enjoying his own meal in the kitchen, rose to answer it, and returned moments later with an expression of evident surprise and concern. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Edmund directly, "there is a gentleman outside asking to speak with you. He says his business cannot wait until morning." Edmund frowned, exchanging a glance with Agnes, before rising from the table. "Did he give a name?" "Mr. Percival Hartley, Your Grace," Nathaniel replied, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees at the mention of that name, Agnes's expression hardening immediately, while Eleanor felt an old, familiar unease settle over her. "Send him away," Eleanor said firmly, rising from her own seat. "He has no business here, and no welcome in this house." "Wait," Edmund said, holding up a hand, his expression grim but determined. If he has traveled all this way, I would rather understand what he intends than allow him to lurk about the village, stirring whatever trouble he came to stir. Let him in, Nathaniel, but stay close. Percival entered the small sitting room moments later, his traveling coat still damp from the evening mist, his expression carrying none of its usual careful neutrality, replaced instead by something harder and more desperate than Eleanor had ever seen from him before. "Edmund," he said without preamble, "I had hoped to speak with you privately, but I see you have brought quite an audience to witness this conversation. Whatever you have to say, Percival, you may say in front of Eleanor and my daughters," Edmund replied coldly. "I have no more private conversations to share with you, given how thoroughly you abused my trust these past months." Percival's jaw tightened, but he pressed forward regardless. "The court has dismissed my petition, as I understand you already know, but I have come to offer you one final opportunity to reconsider, before matters become considerably more public and considerably more damaging to this family's reputation than the scandal you have already endured. I have gathered considerable documentation regarding your judgment throughout this entire affair, documentation I would prefer not to share with the wider public, provided we can reach some reasonable arrangement regarding my own position and prospects." "You are threatening me," Edmund said flatly, "in front of my daughters, in the home their mother has built with her own hands and her own effort, entirely independent of anything either of us has offered her." "I am simply explaining the realities of the situation," Percival replied, though his voice carried less confidence than his words suggested. "You cannot deny that your judgment throughout this entire affair, from your original public announcement to your handling of Vivian's deception, raises legitimate questions about your fitness to manage this family's affairs without oversight." Alice, watching this exchange, with the same serious attention she brought to everything, suddenly spoke up in a clear, steady voice that startled the adults into silence. "Are you the man who wanted our house because we were not sons?" Percival looked down at the child with visible discomfort, clearly unprepared for such direct confrontation from someone he had likely never expected to address him at all. "That is a complicated matter, young lady, not easily explained to a child." "I think it is quite simple," Alice replied, her chin lifted with a confidence that made Eleanor's heart swell with pride, despite the tension of the moment. "You wanted something that was not yours, and you hoped my father would fail so you could have it. That does not sound complicated to me at all." A heavy silence followed this pronouncement, broken finally by Edmund, who stepped forward with an expression that had hardened into something resembling genuine resolve. "My daughter has summarized the situation rather better than either of us managed, Percival. I will say this once, clearly, so there can be no future confusion. I have documented, thoroughly and irrevocably, that Alice, Beatrice, and Charlotte hold full and legitimate standing within this family, regardless of any future marriage or children I might have. Should you attempt to share whatever documentation you have gathered with anyone, I will ensure the full truth of your involvement in Vivian's deception becomes public knowledge, a revelation that would end whatever remaining reputation and prospects you still possess, far more thoroughly than any scandal currently attached to my own name. I suggest you consider carefully whether that trade serves your interests before you take another step down this path." Percival's carefully maintained composure finally cracked entirely, and for a moment, Eleanor saw genuine desperation flash across his features, before he mastered himself once more, gathering what remained of his dignity as he moved toward the door. "You will regret dismissing family so easily, Edmund," he said, though the threat carried considerably less weight than his earlier words had. "But I see there is nothing further to discuss here tonight." He departed into the cold evening without further ceremony, and Nathaniel followed him out to ensure he did not linger near the cottage or the village beyond what was strictly necessary to secure transportation back toward the main road. Once the door had closed firmly behind him, the small sitting room remained quiet for a long moment, before Agnes finally spoke, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and quiet admiration. "I believe that particular chapter has finally reached its proper conclusion," she said, glancing toward Alice with unmistakable pride, "though I confess, I did not expect our youngest advocate to deliver quite such an effective closing argument." Despite the tension of the preceding minutes, Eleanor found herself laughing softly, the sound surprising her with its genuine warmth, and even Edmund managed a small, tired smile as he returned to his seat at the table. "Thank you, Alice," he said quietly. "You spoke more plainly and more courageously than I have managed throughout this entire difficult year. Alice merely shrugged, returning to her plate with the practical unconcern of a child who had said what needed saying and saw no reason to dwell further on the matter, though Eleanor noticed the small, satisfied smile that lingered at the corner of her daughter's mouth for the remainder of the evening. As Edmund prepared to return to the inn, where he and Agnes intended to stay overnight before their journey back to Ashford, he turned once more to Eleanor, with an expression of genuine gratitude, the earlier tension of Percival's unwelcome visit still lingering faintly in the room around them. "Thank you for allowing this visit, Eleanor, and for allowing me to witness, even under such circumstances, exactly what kind of daughters you have raised. I know I have not earned any particular consideration from you, given everything that transpired, but I am grateful, more than I can adequately express, for this opportunity to begin, however imperfectly, making amends for the harm I caused." Eleanor nodded, accepting his gratitude with the same measured composure she had maintained throughout the visit. "I hope you understand, Edmund, that whatever relationship develops between you and our daughters, it will proceed at their pace, guided by their comfort and well-being, rather than your own desire for quick forgiveness or easy resolution. I am willing to allow this process to unfold, but I will not hesitate to reconsider if I sense that your renewed interest causes them any distress or confusion." "I understand completely," Edmund replied, "and I am grateful for whatever opportunity you are willing to extend, on whatever terms you deem appropriate." As the carriage finally departed down the village road the following morning, disappearing around the bend that led back toward the main coastal route, Eleanor stood in her garden, watching until it vanished entirely from sight, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions settling over her. Relief that the visit had proceeded, despite Percival's unwelcome intrusion, without any lasting damage to the fragile progress being made. Cautious hope that her daughters might yet build some meaningful relationship with their father, and above all, a quiet confidence that whatever developed from this point forward, the life she had built in Hartwell remained entirely her own, secure and independent, regardless of whatever choices Edmund made, or whatever schemes his cousin might still attempt, from whatever distance he now retreated, to lick his wounds. The years that followed brought changes both gradual and profound to the lives of everyone touched by the events that had unfolded at Ashford Manor that fateful winter years earlier. Edmund kept his promise, visiting Hartwell regularly throughout the following seasons, his relationship with his daughters growing slowly but genuinely, built on consistent presence and demonstrated respect, rather than empty apologies or grand but ultimately hollow gestures. He wrote to each of them individually as they grew older, took genuine interest in their developing talents and interests, and gradually earned back a measure of trust that Eleanor had once believed might never be possible to restore. Percival, true to Lord Aldridge's earlier warning, did not entirely abandon his ambitions in the immediate aftermath of that tense evening in Hartwell, attempting on 2 further occasions over the following years to raise questions about Edmund's fitness to manage Ashford's affairs. Once through a carefully worded letter to a distant relative with some minor influence in matters of inheritance law, and once through quiet conversations with acquaintances in London designed to keep old rumors of the scandal alive, rather than allowing them to fade naturally with time. Each attempt, however, proved considerably less effective than his earlier scheming, given the thorough documentation Edmund had established regarding his daughter's standing, and given that most of society had, by then, grown considerably more sympathetic toward a duke who had genuinely reformed his earlier prejudices, rather than a distant cousin whose motives grew more transparently self-serving with each renewed attempt. Eventually, Percival relocated permanently to a modest property in the north that he had inherited through his mother's side of the family, his ambitions toward Ashford quietly abandoned, though Agnes continued, for the remainder of her considerable years, to keep a careful and watchful eye on any further correspondence that might suggest renewed interest on his part. Alice, who had shown such early aptitude for her mother's herbal practice, and who had spoken so plainly and courageously in defense of her family's legitimacy that cold winter evening, went on to formalize that knowledge through study, with a respected physician in a nearby city, who took on female students despite the unusual nature of such arrangements, eventually establishing her own practice that combined traditional herbal remedies with more modern medical understanding, earning a reputation throughout the region for combining compassionate care with genuine scientific rigor. She never forgot the lessons her mother had taught her, both about the practical application of herbal medicine and about the deeper importance of independence and self-reliance that had shaped so much of her childhood, and she often told the story, in later years, Of the evening she had faced down a scheming relative twice her age, and found him considerably less formidable than she had expected. Beatrice's early talent for illustration blossomed into genuine artistic skill, and the notebook of careful plant drawings she had begun as a child eventually formed the foundation of a published reference guide to regional medicinal plants, illustrated with her own detailed drawings and compiled with practical information gathered from years assisting her mother and sister in their shared practice. Her work eventually gained recognition beyond their small corner of the country, bringing a measure of genuine professional accomplishment that would have been unimaginable for a woman of her station just a generation earlier. She married, in her middle 20s, a quiet, thoughtful printer from a neighboring town named Frederick Coleman, who had first approached her about producing her illustrated guide, and who had fallen, over the course of their professional collaboration, into a genuine and lasting affection that Beatrice returned in full measure. Charlotte, who had grown up with the least direct memory of the difficult circumstances that had originally brought her family to Hartwell, developed a keen interest in business and finance, eventually taking over the practical management of the family's growing herbal enterprise as it expanded beyond the original small operation Eleanor had begun in her mother's garden. Under Charlotte's careful stewardship, the business grew to supply remedies and treatments to villages and towns throughout the entire region, providing steady employment for numerous local families, while maintaining the same commitment to genuine, compassionate care that had characterized the practice since its earliest days. She proved, in time, to possess a shrewd understanding of contracts and accounts that Arthur Pembroke himself once remarked exceeded his own considerable expertise, a compliment Charlotte accepted with the same practical good humor that characterized most of her interactions. Eleanor herself found continued purpose and satisfaction in her work, gradually stepping back from the daily operations as her daughters took on increasing responsibility, though she remained actively involved in training new practitioners and maintaining the careful standards of quality and compassion that had defined the enterprise since its founding. She never remarried, having found in her independent life a completeness that she had never experienced during her years of marriage, though she maintained cordial, even warm relations with Edmund as the years passed, their shared commitment to their daughter's well-being eventually evolving into something resembling genuine friendship, however different from the marriage they had once shared. Agnes lived long enough to see her great-granddaughters begin establishing their own independent lives and accomplishments, taking evident pride in watching the family legacy she had worked so hard to protect and guide take shape in forms she could never have anticipated during her own younger years, when the rigid expectations of inheritance and gender had shaped so much of what possibilities seemed available to women within families like theirs. She often remarked, in her final years, that watching her great-granddaughters build genuine, independent success brought her more genuine satisfaction than any of the traditional markers of family legacy she had once believed mattered most, and she spoke often, with particular fondness, of the evening young Alice had silenced a grown man's scheming, with nothing more than a child's plain and honest question. Edmund, for his part, never remarried either, devoting himself instead to managing Ashford's affairs with a renewed sense of responsibility and humility that had been notably absent during his younger years. He eventually revised the terms of inheritance that had originally excluded his daughters from any claim to the estate, working with legal counsel to ensure that Alice, Beatrice, and Charlotte would each receive appropriate provision from the family's resources, not because they needed such support given their own considerable accomplishments, but because he wished to demonstrate, through concrete action rather than mere words, his genuine recognition of their equal worth and standing within the family. He also established, in later years, a small scholarship fund at a women's college in London, quietly endowed and administered without his name attached, that provided assistance to young women pursuing medical or scientific study who might otherwise have lacked the resources to do so, a private gesture of atonement that only Agnes and Eleanor ever fully understood the significance of. Clara eventually married Henry Ashworth, the fisherman whose quiet friendship had grown into genuine affection over the years, and their combined family became a permanent fixture within the close-knit community that had grown around Eleanor's cottage and expanding business, with Clara continuing to assist in various aspects of the herbal practice, even as she built her own family life, alongside her continued friendship with Eleanor and her daughters. Her own son from that marriage, a bright, curious boy named William, grew up alongside Alice, Beatrice, and Charlotte, almost as though they were siblings, eventually training under Alice's careful instruction to become a respected physician in his own right, carrying forward the same values of compassionate, patient care that had first taken root in Eleanor's modest garden years earlier. Looking back across the years that had passed since that difficult morning when Eleanor had first walked away from Ashford Manor, with 3 daughters and little more than determination and hope, she often reflected on how differently her life, and the lives of her children, might have unfolded had she chosen to remain, to beg for whatever scraps of acceptance Edmund might have been willing to offer, rather than claiming her own independence and building something genuinely hers. The pain of those early days, the humiliation of Edmund's public announcement, the uncertainty of starting over in an unfamiliar village, with little more than her mother's small cottage and a handful of half-remembered herbal remedies, the quiet danger posed by a patient cousin who had waited years for his own opportunity to reshape the family's fortunes, all of it had ultimately led toward a life far richer and more meaningful than anything she might have achieved had she simply accepted the limited role Ashford's rigid traditions had originally assigned to her. Her daughters grew into women who understood, through their mother's example rather than mere instruction, that their worth had never depended on their gender, on their ability to secure a husband's approval, or on their usefulness and produce heirs for someone else's legacy. They had learned instead that genuine strength came from building something authentic and lasting through one's own effort and skill, that setbacks and cruelty, however painful in the moment, could become the foundation for something far more meaningful than the comfortable but limited existence they might otherwise have known, and that even the most patient and calculating schemes, like those Percival had constructed so carefully over so many years, could ultimately be undone by nothing more complicated than honesty, documentation, and the plain, unflinching courage of a child, unwilling to let injustice go unnamed. On a warm summer evening, many years after that first difficult winter, Eleanor sat once more in her garden, now considerably expanded from its original modest boundaries, watching her grown daughters and their own growing families gather for a celebration marking the 20th anniversary of the herbal practice that had grown from her mother's simple garden into a respected institution, serving the entire region. Edmund had come for the occasion as well, sitting comfortably among his grandchildren, a far cry from the proud, cold man who had once stood in a birthing chamber and turned away from his newborn daughter without a single word of welcome. Agnes, though considerably frailer than in her earlier years, remained a beloved and honored guest at every such gathering, delighting in stories from her great-grandchildren that she insisted rivaled any tale from the grand history books lining Ashford's library shelves. As the evening light faded gently over the cliffs and the distant sound of waves provided a familiar, comforting rhythm to the celebration, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the strange, difficult, but ultimately transformative journey that had brought them all to this moment. She had once been a woman defined entirely by her failure to produce a son, cast aside by a husband who valued legacy over genuine love, abandoned in favor of a mistress whose own ambitions had ultimately proven as hollow and destructive as the prejudices that had originally driven Edmund's cruel choices, and quietly threatened by a cousin whose patient scheming had very nearly succeeded in reshaping her daughters' futures without their consent or knowledge. But she had refused to remain defined by that rejection, choosing instead to build something entirely her own, something that had ultimately proven far more valuable and lasting than anything Ashford's title or legacy could have offered. Her daughters had grown into accomplished, independent women who understood their own worth beyond any measure a rigid, outdated tradition might have once assigned them. Even Edmund, however imperfectly, had eventually learned the genuine cost of the prejudices that had once governed his choices, working steadily over many years to demonstrate real change rather than empty words. And even Percival, whatever bitterness he carried into his own quiet retirement in the north, had ultimately discovered that patience alone could not overcome honesty, documentation, and the fierce, protective love of a mother, determined to secure her daughters' futures against every threat that dared present itself. The story of the Duke, who had abandoned his wife for giving birth to daughters, had become, in the end, a story of a woman who had refused to accept that rejection as the final word on her own worth or her daughters' futures. It had become a story of resilience, of independence, claimed rather than granted, of genuine accomplishment, built through patient effort rather than inherited privilege, and of quiet, determined courage, triumphing over the calculated schemes of those who believed patience and manipulation alone entitled them to whatever they desired. And as Eleanor watched her family gathered together in the fading summer light, 3 generations bound together, not by rigid tradition or desperate need for a male heir, but by genuine love and mutual respect, earned through years of honest effort. She understood with complete certainty that whatever pain had marked the beginning of this journey, its ending had proven far richer and more meaningful than anything she could have imagined on that difficult morning when she first carried her 3 daughters away from Ashford Manor and toward a future entirely her own to define.